My Stepson smirked and said, "Grandma, you manipulated Dad, now we are taking everything back." The lawyer's words hit Carolyn like ice water. "Mrs. King, your stepchildren are contesting the will. They're claiming you manipulated their father." Across the mahogany table, Bradley smirked while Sloane dabbed fake tears. 15 years of marriage reduced to a gold digger's con. They expected her to crumble, to walk away quietly. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Some women get stronger with age, and Carolyn King was about to prove it. 3 months had passed since Robert's funeral, and Carolyn King still couldn't walk into his study without feeling the weight of his absence. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above his mahogany desk, the same desk where he'd sat every morning with his coffee, reading glasses perched on his nose, utterly absorbed in whatever book had captured his attention that week. His reading glasses were still there, folded neatly beside a leather-bound copy of Steinbeck's East of Eden. He'd been rereading it for the 3rd time when the stroke took him. They never got to finish their debate about whether Kathy Ames was born evil or made that way. Carolyn traced her finger along the desk's edge, feeling the smooth wood worn soft by decades of use. 73 years old, silver hair swept into the same elegant twist she'd worn for 20 years. She moved through the house with the careful grace of someone navigating a museum of memories. Each room held ghosts of their life together. Not the haunting kind, but the warm kind that made you smile even as tears pricked your eyes. She'd risen at 6, as always. Made coffee in the French press. Robert had insisted brewed the best cup. Soft-boiled eggs and wheat toast, cut into precise triangles. His favorite breakfast, though now she ate it alone at a table set for one. The newspaper arrived at 6:30, and she still folded it in thirds the way he liked it, even though there was no one to read it but her. The garden called to her next, as it did every morning. Robert had planted the rose garden for their 5th anniversary. Peace roses, he'd said, because that's what she'd brought to his life. She tended them now with secateurs and gentle hands, deadheading the spent blooms, encouraging new growth. The roses were thriving. She wished she could say the same about herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Frances Wilde, her best friend of 30 years. "Coffee this afternoon? I'm worried about you." Carolyn smiled despite herself. Frances had been checking on her relentlessly since the funeral. Former judge, current fierce protector, permanently concerned that Carolyn was withering away in this big house full of memories. She wasn't withering. She was surviving. There was a difference. By 9 o'clock, Carolyn was dressed for her volunteer shift at the Riverside Museum of Art. Tailored navy slacks, Oisi cashmere sweater in cream, her grandmother's pearls at her throat. She studied herself in the mirror, seeing what the world saw. A well-preserved woman of a certain age, widow of the prominent Robert King, picture of grace and composure. What the mirror didn't show was the loneliness that sat like a stone in her chest, the way she still reached for him in the middle of the night, the conversations she carried on with his memory while watering his roses. The museum had been her refuge these past months. Before Robert, she'd been a curator, a good one, with a sharp eye for emerging artists and a reputation for building innovative exhibitions. She'd given it up when they married, a decision that had seemed natural at the time. Robert traveled for business, had health issues that required attention, wanted her company. She'd wanted his. 15 years of reading together in companionable silence, of traveling to galleries in Paris and Florence, of building a life that felt like coming home. Now she volunteered on the acquisitions committee, offering expertise earned through decades of study and instinct. It wasn't the same as her career had been, but it filled the hours. It gave her purpose. It reminded her she'd once been someone other than Robert King's wife. At the museum, she spent 3 hours reviewing proposals for a new contemporary exhibition. Her insights were sharp, her recommendations sound, but she noticed the way some of the younger board members glanced at each other when she spoke, a subtle dismissiveness that said, "nice old lady," rather than "experienced professional." She'd grown used to it. Women of a certain age became invisible unless they were wealthy widows, and then they became targets. Lunch was a salad at home, eaten standing at the kitchen counter while sorting through mail. Condolence cards had finally stopped arriving, replaced now by the mundane realities of estate management. Bank statements, insurance documents, lawyers' letters about probate. Jessica Moreno, Robert's estate attorney, had assured her everything was in order. The will was clear, properly executed, beyond dispute. Robert had been meticulous about such things. Still, Carolyn found herself reading and rereading the documents as if the words might change, as if she needed to memorize proof that she'd mattered to him, that their life together had been real and valued and worthy of legal protection. The afternoon brought her neighbor, Amy Porter, to the door. 32, single mother to 6-year-old Sophie, Amy had become an unexpected friend in the months since Robert's death. She arrived with a casserole she'd clearly made from scratch and an apology in her eyes. "I know you probably have a freezer full of these," Amy said, "but Sophie helped make it, and she was so excited to bring it over." Sophie peeked around her mother's legs, gap-toothed smile wide. "We made mac and cheese, Miss Carolyn, the fancy kind with breadcrumbs on top." Carolyn's heart squeezed. She crouched down, her knees protesting slightly, and met Sophie's eyes. "My absolute favorite. Thank you, sweetheart." "Mama says Mr. King is in heaven now," Sophie said with the blunt honesty of children. "Are you very sad?" "Very sad," Carolyn admitted, "but getting a little better every day." "That's good," Sophie nodded sagely. "Mama says sadness doesn't last forever. It just visits for a while." Amy blushed. "Sorry, she's been very philosophical lately." "She's very wise," Carolyn said, standing and ushering them inside. "Would you both like some cookies? I made Robert's favorite oatmeal raisin yesterday. I don't know why. Habit, I suppose." They sat in the sunlit kitchen, Sophie chattering about first grade, while Amy and Carolyn exchanged the comfortable small talk of women who'd found unexpected kinship. Amy never asked intrusive questions about Robert or the estate or how Carolyn was really doing. She just showed up, brought food, let Sophie provide the kind of uncomplicated affection that required nothing in return. When they left, Carolyn stood at the window watching them walk hand in hand back to their smaller house, 3 doors down. She'd never had children, a medical impossibility she'd made peace with decades ago. But watching Sophie skip along the sidewalk, she felt the old ache of what might have been. Robert's children, Bradley and Sloane, had never brought their own children to visit. His grandchildren were strangers to her, kept carefully separate by parents who'd never accepted their father's second wife. She'd tried those first years of marriage, sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, extended invitations to holidays and Sunday dinners. The cards went unacknowledged. The gifts were never mentioned. The invitations were declined with increasingly transparent excuses. Robert had been disappointed but not surprised. "They're angry I moved on from their mother," he'd explained. "Give them time." She'd given them 15 years. Time hadn't helped. By evening, Frances arrived for their standing Thursday dinner, a tradition that predated Robert, would outlast grief, anchored Carolyn to something beyond widowhood. Frances swept in with Thai takeout and a bottle of good wine, her short silver hair perfectly styled, her posture ramrod straight from decades on the bench. "You look tired," Frances announced, setting containers on the counter. "You look judgmental," Carolyn countered. "I contain multitudes." Frances poured 2 generous glasses of Pinot Noir. "How was the museum?" "Fine, useful. They're considering a retrospective on women abstract expressionists. I recommended—" "Carolyn." Frances's voice softened. "How are you really?" And there it was. The question Carolyn had been deflecting for months. She took a long sip of wine, feeling it warm her throat, loosen the tight knot of composure she wore like armor. "I'm lonely," she admitted. "The house is too big. The bed is too empty. I keep expecting him to walk through the door wanting to tell me about something he read or asking what I think about dinner plans." She paused. And I'm scared. Scared of what? That I'll forget, that the memory of him will fade and I'll lose him all over again. Carolyn's voice cracked. That I'll become just another widow at the club, defined entirely by who I married and lost, with nothing left of who I was before. Frances reached across the counter and gripped Carolyn's hand. You were brilliant before Robert. You're brilliant after him. The marriage didn't define you, it enhanced you. There's a difference. I gave up my career for him. You chose partnership over career. Many people make that choice. It doesn't erase everything you accomplished before or diminish everything you could still accomplish now. Carolyn wanted to believe her, but at 73, starting over felt less like opportunity and more like admission of time wasted. They ate pad thai and drank wine and talked about everything except Robert until Frances, 3/4 through the bottle, asked the question Carolyn had been dreading. Have you heard from Bradley or Sloan? Not since the funeral. Carolyn picked at her noodles. Bradley gave a very moving eulogy about his father's business acumen and civic contributions. Sloan cried beautifully. Neither of them acknowledged I existed. Charming children. They're grieving in their own way. They're punishing you for marrying their father. Frances's tone was sharp. There's a difference. Carolyn couldn't argue. At the reception following Robert's funeral, Bradley had worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, accepting condolences, positioning himself as the primary mourner. Sloan had performed theatrical grief, dabbing her eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs while dressed in designer black. They'd stood on either side of Robert's casket like sentries, a united front of biological children, while Carolyn, his wife of 15 years, had been relegated to the periphery. Several of Robert's longtime friends had sought her out, offered genuine sympathy, shared memories of the couple they'd been. But the social set, the country club crowd, the people who'd never quite accepted the second Mrs. King, had kept their distance. She'd heard the whispers, 15 years younger, married him at 58, convenient timing. Never mind that Robert had pursued her. Never mind that she'd been financially comfortable in her own right. Never mind that they'd signed a prenuptial agreement to protect both their interests. The narrative was written before the ink dried on the marriage certificate. Gold digger marries wealthy widower, waits for payday. Jessica called yesterday, Carolyn said, changing the subject. The estate is moving through probate smoothly. Should be settled in a few months. Good. Frances refilled their glasses. Robert left everything clearly documented. No room for dispute. Carolyn nodded, but something in her chest tightened. She thought of the way Bradley had looked at her at the funeral, not with grief, but with calculation. The way Sloane's tears had dried remarkably quickly when speaking to the estate attorney. The way neither of them had called to check on her, to share memories, to acknowledge that she might be grieving too. She pushed the thoughts away. Frances was right. The will was clear. Robert had been meticulous. There was nothing to worry about. But that night, alone in the king-sized bed that felt like an ocean of empty space, Carolyn couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming. She touched Robert's pillow, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, though she knew she was probably imagining it, and whispered into the darkness, I miss you. God, I miss you. The house creaked and settled around her. Outside, an owl called from the oak tree Robert had refused to trim because he liked watching the birds nest there every spring. The digital clock on his nightstand flipped to midnight, then to 12:01, then to 12:02. Carolyn lay awake, counting the hours until dawn, when she could make coffee and tend the roses and pretend she was fine. The call came 3 days later. Carolyn was in the garden, deadheading roses in the warm April sunshine, when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer. Probably another telemarketer, another sympathy call from a distant acquaintance who'd just heard the news. But something made her swipe to accept. Mrs. King? This is Jessica Moreno. The estate attorney's voice was professional, but strained, as if she were choosing words carefully. Carolyn's stomach clenched. Jessica. Hello, is everything all right with the estate? A pause. Too long. I'd like to schedule a meeting. There's been a development. What kind of development? Another pause. I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Are you available tomorrow morning? Say, 10 o'clock? Carolyn's mouth went dry. Can you at least tell me what this is about? It concerns the will. Jessica's tone was carefully neutral. Bradley and Sloane King have retained counsel. They've indicated they plan to contest. The world tilted. Carolyn sat down heavily on the garden bench, dirt-stained gloves still on her hands, phone pressed to her ear. Contest? On what grounds? We'll discuss everything tomorrow. I'm so sorry, Carolyn. I know this isn't what you need right now. After Jessica hung up, Carolyn sat in the garden for a long time, staring at Robert's roses without seeing them. Contest the will. The words echoed in her head, growing louder with each repetition. They were actually going to do it. Bradley and Sloane were going to challenge their father's wishes, dispute his final decisions, claim he'd been manipulated or confused, or... Her phone rang again. Francis. I just got off the phone with Jessica Moreno, Francis said without preamble. Tell me you're sitting down. I'm sitting. Those ungrateful, entitled, mercenary little... Francis unleashed a string of profanity that would have made her bailiff blush. Carolyn, this is going to get ugly. You need to prepare yourself. For what, exactly? For them to drag your name through the mud, to question every aspect of your marriage, to paint you as a predator and Robert as a victim. Francis's voice gentled. Sweetheart, estate contests are nasty under the best circumstances. When adult children are involved, when there's money at stake, when they've decided you're the villain, it's going to be brutal. Carolyn closed her eyes. The roses smelled too sweet, cloying in the warm air. She felt suddenly nauseated. What do I do? You fight. You defend Robert's wishes. You refuse to let them erase you from his life story. Francis paused. And you call me after you meet with Jessica. I'm coming with you to the next one. That night, Carolyn couldn't sleep at all. She wandered the house like a ghost, touching things Robert had touched, sitting in his favorite chair, trying to absorb any remaining essence of the man who'd loved her. Or had he? The doubt crept in like poison, insidious, spreading, contaminating every memory. Had he been manipulated? She'd managed his medications those last years, coordinated with his doctors, decided what activities were too strenuous. Was that love or control? They'd traveled less as he aged, socialized less, spent more quiet evenings at home. Had she isolated him? She found herself in his study at 3 a.m, pulling out photo albums, looking for proof. Here they were in Florence, standing before Botticelli's Birth of Venus, his arm around her waist. Here at the gallery opening in Manhattan, both dressed in formal wear, laughing at something outside the frame. Here at home, Christmas morning, matching pajamas he'd insisted they buy as a joke. Every photo showed the same thing. 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Partners, companions, friends who'd fallen in love late in life and decided to build something together. But would a jury see that? Or would they see a younger woman, relatively speaking, who'd married an older, wealthy man and convinced him to leave her everything? She pulled open his desk drawer, looking for anything that might help her case. Tax returns, business correspondence, legal documents. And then, wedged in the back, a leather journal she'd never seen before. Carolyn hesitated, feeling like an intruder in her own home. But Robert was gone, and his children were coming for her, and maybe, just maybe, he'd left something that could help. She opened to the first page, Robert's handwriting neat and precise, dated 3 years before his death. Started this journal on Dr. Martinez's recommendation. She says writing helps process difficult emotions. I'm processing plenty of those lately, particularly regarding Bradley and Sloan. Carolyn's hands shook as she read, entry after entry chronicling Robert's disappointments in his children, his frustrations with their entitlement, his sadness at their emotional distance, and woven through it all, like a golden thread, his gratitude for Carolyn. She read to me today when my eyes were tired, one entry said. Makes the voices different for each character, even though she pretends she doesn't. I'm the luckiest man alive. Another. Bradley called asking for another loan. When I suggested he live within his means, he accused me of favoring Carolyn with the money I'm denying him. He doesn't understand I'm trying to teach him, not punish him. And another. Carolyn planted white roses today, said they reminded her of fresh starts. I wonder if she knows she gave me a fresh start, a second chance at love I never thought I'd have. Carolyn read through the night, tears streaming down her face. This was Robert. His voice, his thoughts, his truth. And it was all here, documenting a sound mind, clear intentions, and a love that was absolutely real. As dawn broke, she called Jessica Moreno's emergency line. I found something, she said. Robert's journal, 3 years of entries. Jessica, it changes everything. Chapter 2. The law offices of Moreno and Associates occupied the 7th floor of a gleaming downtown building with views of the river. Carolyn had been here before, signing the prenuptial agreement, updating beneficiary designations, routine estate planning over the years. Then the visits had felt protective, sensible, almost boring in their practicality. Today, walking through the heavy glass doors, she felt like she was entering a battlefield. Jessica Moreno met her in the reception area, professional smile in place but worry evident in her eyes. At 45, Jessica carried herself with the controlled confidence of someone who'd fought hard for every success. Her handshake was firm, her suit impeccably tailored, her expression carefully neutral. Carolyn, thank you for coming. Let's talk in the conference room. They walked down a carpeted hallway lined with abstract art, the kind Carolyn would have evaluated with a curator's eye in another lifetime, before her own life became the subject of scrutiny and evaluation. The conference room was all glass and chrome, with a mahogany table that could seat 12. Today, 6 chairs were occupied. Jessica sat at the head. Carolyn took the seat beside her, and across the table, like opposing armies, sat Bradley King, Sloan King, and their attorney, a man whose name tag read Mitchell Carver, and whose sharp suit and sharper eyes screamed expensive litigation. Carolyn's breath caught. She'd expected a meeting with Jessica, perhaps a phone call with opposing counsel. She hadn't expected an ambush. Bradley looked exactly like his father. Same strong jawline, same broad shoulders, same thick hair now graying at the temples. But where Robert's eyes had been warm and thoughtful, Bradley's were cold calculation. At 49, he'd never quite lived up to his father's expectations, a fact that had created tension long before Carolyn entered the picture. Sloan, at 46, had inherited her father's height and her mother's delicate features. She'd also inherited a talent for performance. The tears were already gathering in her perfectly made-up eyes, one hand clutching a tissue as if preparing for an imminent breakdown. "Mrs. King," Mitchell Carver began, his voice smooth as silk and just as slippery, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "I wasn't aware I'd agreed to anything," Carolyn said quietly. She looked at Jessica. "I thought this was a meeting between my attorney and myself." "My clients wanted the opportunity to discuss this matter face to face," Carver continued as if she hadn't spoken, "before filing formal challenges and engaging in costly litigation." Bradley leaned forward, his expression attempting sympathy, but landing somewhere near contempt. "Carolyn, we're worried about Dad, about the state he was in those last few years. You were very influential." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Carolyn felt her pulse quicken but kept her voice steady. "Your father was completely sound of mind until the day he died." "Was he?" Sloane's voice broke on a theatrical sob. We hardly saw him those last years. You were always there, always controlling who he talked to, what he did. I was there because I was his wife, Carolyn interrupted, steel entering her tone. And you hardly saw him because you chose not to visit. I invited you for every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday dinner for 15 years. You isolated him, Bradley said flatly, poisoned him against his own children, made him believe we only cared about his money. Did you care about anything else? The words were out before Carolyn could stop them. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Mitchell Carver smiled, the expression of a predator scenting blood in the water. My clients are prepared to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity, he said, sliding a thick document across the table. The evidence is substantial. The prenuptial agreement was modified twice, each time giving you more. Life insurance beneficiaries were changed. Assets were transferred, all while Mr. King was increasingly dependent on your care. Carolyn's hands trembled as she picked up the document. The title page said it all. Petition to contest. Last will and testament of Robert James King, deceased. This is ridiculous, she breathed. Robert was examined by his physician 2 weeks before he died. Dr. Chen confirmed he was completely lucid. Dr. Chen, who you accompanied to every appointment, Bradley interjected, who only saw what you allowed him to see. That's not... However, Carver interrupted smoothly, my clients are prepared to settle this matter quietly, to avoid the unpleasantness of public litigation and the unfortunate scrutiny it would bring to everyone involved. He slid another document across. Settlement offer, read the heading. Carolyn scanned it quickly. They were offering her the house and $2 million. Everything else, the investment portfolio, the business holdings, the charitable foundation Robert had established, would revert to Bradley and Sloane. It sounded generous until you realized the estate was worth over $7 million. They were offering her less than a third of what Robert had explicitly left her. This is your father's will, Carolyn said, looking between Bradley and Sloane. These were his wishes. He was specific, deliberate, and completely clear-minded. How can we honor our father's true intentions? Bradley cut in. Very easily, by correcting the decisions he made when he wasn't himself. He was himself. I was married to him for 15 years. I knew him. You knew him 15 years. Sloane's tears had dried up, her voice hardening. I knew him my entire life. We're his real family. The words hit like a physical blow. Real family. As if 15 years of partnership, of daily care, of love and companionship and building a life together, as if all of that was less real than the accident of biology. Carolyn looked at Jessica, who was taking notes with controlled fury, evident in the set of her jaw. What they're not telling you, Jessica said calmly, is that contesting a will is extremely difficult. They'll need to prove either that Robert lacked testamentary capacity, which his medical records will disprove, or that you exercised undue influence to the point of overriding his free will. That's a very high bar to meet. We'll meet it, Carver said confidently. Discovery will be extensive. Mrs. King's entire relationship with the deceased will be examined, her romantic history, her financial situation before the marriage, every decision made during the marriage, every conversation, every action, every moment of care that could be reframed as control. The threat was clear. Take the settlement or have your entire life dissected in public. Carolyn felt the walls closing in. This was what they wanted, to make her so afraid of exposure, so terrified of judgment that she'd simply surrender. Take the consolation prize and disappear from their father's legacy. She looked at Bradley's smirk, at Sloane's calculating eyes, the tears completely gone now, at Mitchell Carver's predatory smile, and something inside her, something that had been dormant for months, buried under grief and loneliness and the weight of being a good widow, sparked to life. "No," she said quietly. Everyone looked at her. "No," Carver repeated. "No, I won't sign your settlement. I won't accept your characterization of my marriage. I won't let you erase me from your father's life story because it's convenient for your bank accounts." Carolyn stood, her legs steadier than she'd expected. She looked at Bradley and Sloane, really looked at them, and saw what Robert had seen. Two people who'd spent their lives feeling entitled to their father's success without ever earning it themselves. "Your father was the most sound-minded, intelligent, intentional person I've ever known," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "He knew exactly what he was doing when he made his will. He knew you'd contest it. He told me you would. And he trusted me to be strong enough to defend his wishes." She picked up the settlement offer and placed it back on the table, deliberately, like laying down a gauntlet. "I'll see you in court." The walk to her car was the longest of Carolyn's life. Her legs felt like water. Her hands shook so badly she could barely grip her keys. She made it to the parking garage, to her Mercedes, before the shaking turned to full-body tremors. She sat behind the wheel, hands gripping it until her knuckles turned white, and tried to breathe through the panic. What had she done? She'd just turned down $2 million and a guarantee of keeping her home. She'd just committed herself to a legal battle that would drain her savings, expose her private life, and, if she lost, leave her with nothing. Her phone rang. Francis. "How'd it go?" her friend asked. Carolyn couldn't answer. Her throat had closed up, tears finally breaking through the careful composure she'd maintained in the conference room. "That bad?" Francis's voice gentled. "Where are you?" "Parking garage. Francis, I can't breathe." "Yes, you can. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4, out for 4. Do it with me." Francis counted her through breathing exercises until the panic attack subsided, until Carolyn could speak again. "They offered me a settlement," she finally said, $2 million and the house. "And you told them to shove it where the sun doesn't shine?" Despite everything, Carolyn almost laughed. "More or less." "Good. Come to my house. I'll open wine, you can cry or rage or both, and then we'll figure out how to destroy them." "Francis." "Carolyn, listen to me. You just did the hardest thing. You stood up to them. Everything from here might be difficult, but nothing will be as hard as that first no. Now drive carefully and get over here." The drive to Francis's craftsman-style home took 20 minutes through downtown traffic. Carolyn drove on autopilot, her mind replaying the conference room confrontation on an endless loop. Bradley's smirk, Sloane's fake tears, the word settlement that actually meant go away quietly. Francis met her at the door with a hug fierce enough to crack ribs and a glass of wine large enough to be technically illegal. "Tell me everything," Francis commanded, pulling her to the comfortable living room filled with books and art and the accumulated warmth of a life well lived. Carolyn told her. Every word, every accusation, every ugly implication. Francis listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. "Undue influence," Francis finally said. "That's their angle. They'll claim you isolated Robert, controlled his decisions, manipulated him into changing his will. But I didn't. Robert made every decision himself. The prenuptial updates were his idea. He insisted. He wanted me protected." "I believe you. The question is, can you prove it?" Carolyn thought of the journal still sitting on Robert's desk where she'd left it that morning. Maybe. Robert kept a journal, 3 years' worth of entries. He documented everything, his disappointments in Bradley and Sloane, his reasons for the will, his gratitude for our marriage. Francis sat up straighter. Everything? Everything, including entries from 2 weeks before he died, completely lucid, discussing his exact wishes. That's contemporaneous documentation of testamentary intent by the testator himself. Carolyn, that's gold. That could win your case. Could. The word hung between them, full of uncertainty. What if it's not enough? Carolyn asked quietly. What if people believe I manipulated him? What if... Francis, what if they're right? Not about the manipulation, but about... She struggled to articulate the fear that had been growing since the conference room. What if I don't deserve it? I didn't give him children. I only knew him 15 years. His real family... Stop. Francis's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. First, you are his real family. Marriage makes you family. That's not negotiable. Second, love isn't measured in years or offspring. It's measured in presence, care, partnership, all of which you gave him abundantly. But society has spent millennia telling women they only have value through their biological functions. Don't you dare internalize that garbage. Francis gripped Carolyn's hands. Robert loved you. He chose you. He made legal provisions to protect you because he knew his children would do exactly what they're doing now. Honor that. Honor him. Fight. Carolyn wanted to believe her, but doubt had taken root, spreading like poison through every memory. That night, back home in her empty house, Carolyn did something she hadn't done since the funeral. She went through photo albums, but this time with a different purpose. She wasn't looking for happy memories. She was looking for evidence. Here was Robert at Bradley's college graduation, arm around his son's shoulders. Bradley was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. And Robert's expression, Carolyn looked closer, was proud but strained. The caption on the back, in Robert's handwriting, Bradley graduated barely, spent more time at fraternity parties than classes, refused my offer of business school, says he wants to find himself in Europe. I'm funding another year of self-discovery. Another photo, Sloane's wedding, 10 years before Carolyn met Robert. Sloane was radiant in white. Robert stood stiffly beside her, his smile forced. The caption, Walk Sloane down the aisle. She's marrying for money, not love. Reminds me too much of her mother. I hope I'm wrong. And then, photos from Carolyn's years, Robert and Carolyn in Italy, both genuinely laughing at something outside the frame. At a gallery opening, engaged in intense discussion about a sculpture. At home, reading side by side, his hand resting on her knee in casual affection. The captions were different. Perfect day. She makes me think. Home. The visual narrative was clear, at least to Carolyn. But would a jury see it? Or would they see what they expected to see? An older man surrounded by a younger woman, isolated from his children, convinced to change his will. She pulled out her phone and called Jessica. Carolyn, it's almost 11. I know, I'm sorry, I need to know the truth. What are our chances, really? Jessica was quiet for a moment. Honestly, it's going to be hard. Estate contests favor biological children, especially when they can paint a narrative of undue influence. But we have strong defenses. Robert's medical records, the prenuptial agreement showing his clear intent to protect you, witness testimony from people who saw your marriage. And the journal, Carolyn said. Robert's private journal documenting his state of mind, his relationship with his children, his love for me. That helps enormously. But Carolyn, you need to understand, this won't just be a legal battle. It'll be personal. They're going to dig into your past, question your motives, drag your name through mud. Every choice you made during the marriage will be scrutinized and reframed as manipulation. I understand. Do you? Because once we start this fight, there's no going back. You'll be deposed, you'll testify. You'll have to relive your entire relationship with Robert while hostile attorneys try to make you look like a predator. Can you handle that? Carolyn thought about it, really thought about it. The scrutiny, the judgment, the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of the verdict. Then she thought about Robert, about his journal entries, his clear wishes, his trust that she'd be strong enough to defend them, about 15 years of love and partnership reduced to Undue influence because his children preferred money to honoring their father's autonomy. Yes, she said, I can handle it, because the alternative is letting them erase me from his life story, and I won't do that. I can't. Then we fight, Jessica said. And Carolyn, for what it's worth, I believe you. I've seen marriages like yours before. Late-life love that's real and deep and completely legitimate. I've also seen adult children like Bradley and Sloan, entitled, angry, convinced the world owes them their parents' money. I'm going to do everything in my power to protect you. After they hung up, Carolyn sat in Robert's study, surrounded by evidence of the life they'd built. She pulled out the journal again, reading through entries at random. One from 18 months before his death caught her eye. Bradley called today asking for an advance on his inheritance. When I asked what happened to the $50,000 I gave him last year, he got defensive, said I wouldn't understand that I'm out of touch with modern life. I told him I understood perfectly. He's been living beyond his means his entire adult life, expecting me to fund his choices. We fought. He hung up on me. Carolyn found me upset afterward, brought tea, sat with me without needing to fill the silence with talk. She understands that sometimes presence is enough. I don't think my children have ever learned that lesson. Another entry, from 6 months before his death. Updated my will again today. Jessica thinks I'm being excessive, but I need Carolyn protected. I've left both Bradley and Sloan substantial inheritances, more than they've earned, honestly. But the bulk goes to Carolyn and the foundation. She'll use it wisely. They'll squander it and resent me for not leaving more. I can't let their resentment dictate my choices anymore. I'm choosing love over biology. I'm choosing partnership over entitlement. I only wish I could be there to defend that choice when they inevitably challenge it. Carolyn's vision blurred with tears. He'd known. He'd known exactly what would happen, and he'd trusted her to be strong enough. She wouldn't let him down. The next morning, Carolyn called Jessica with new resolve. What do we do first? First, we gather evidence, medical records, financial documents, witness statements from everyone who can testify to Robert's state of mind and the authenticity of your marriage. I'll need a complete timeline of your relationship, how you met, the progression of your romance, the decision to marry, everything. The more detail, the better. When do we start? Now. Can you come to my office this afternoon? We'll begin building your case. Building your case. As if her marriage was a legal construct that needed assembling, rather than a living, breathing relationship that had existed independent of courtrooms and attorneys. But this was the reality now. Her love would be measured, quantified, proven or disproven by strangers who'd never met Robert, never witnessed the quiet intimacy of 15 years together. Carolyn dressed carefully for the meeting, navy slacks, cream silk blouse, her grandmother's pearls, armor disguised as propriety. She looked at herself in the mirror and practiced the expression of calm confidence, the mask of a woman who had nothing to hide and everything to fight for. The woman in the mirror looked convincing. She hoped the woman underneath was strong enough to sustain the performance. Chapter 3. Jessica's office was a different space than the intimidating conference room where the ambush had occurred. This was her personal workspace, smaller, warmer, with diplomas on the walls and family photos on the desk. A picture of an elderly woman caught Carolyn's attention. Elegant, silver-haired, eyes full of wisdom. My grandmother, Jessica said, following her gaze. She's part of why I do this work. Jessica spent the next 3 hours walking Carolyn through what would be required. Financial records going back 15 years, every bank statement, every investment decision, every transfer of assets, medical records from Robert's physicians documenting his cognitive capacity, witness lists, anyone who could testify to the marriage's authenticity, Robert's state of mind, the stepchildren's actual relationship with their father. I need you to document everything, Jessica said, handing Carolyn a thick folder. Write down how you met, your courtship, the decision to marry, daily routines, inside jokes, conversations about his children, arguments you had, and what you argued about. The more specific, the better. Carolyn stared at the blank pages. You want me to turn my marriage into evidence. I want you to show what the marriage really was. Not the caricature Bradley and Sloane will paint, but the truth. Jessica's expression softened. I know it feels invasive, like you're justifying love that shouldn't need justification. But that's exactly what they're counting on. That you'll be too proud, too private, too dignified to defend yourself. Don't give them that advantage. Over the next week, Carolyn lived in her past. She wrote and rewrote the story of her relationship with Robert, each version more detailed than the last. She pulled out old calendars, credit card statements, anything that could document their life together. She wrote about meeting him at the gallery exhibition, how he'd stood before a Rothko painting for 20 minutes, genuinely engaged rather than pretending to understand, how their conversation about abstract expressionism had turned into dinner, then coffee the next day, then months of dating that felt like coming home. She wrote about his proposal, not romantic by conventional standards, but perfect for them. They'd been reading in his study, companionable silence punctuated only by turning pages. He'd looked up suddenly and said, I want to spend whatever years I have left doing exactly this, with exactly you. Will you marry me? She wrote about the prenuptial agreement negotiations, his insistence on protecting her insistence it wasn't necessary, his eventual compromise. They'd sign one, but he'd review it yearly and adjust as needed. Marriage is partnership, he'd said. The agreement should reflect what we're building together, not protect us from each other. She wrote about the small daily intimacies that define a real marriage, how he liked his coffee, what they argued about, politics mostly, he was more conservative than she was, the silent negotiations of sharing space with another person, his habit of reading out loud when something struck him as particularly insightful, her habit of humming while cooking, which he claimed he loved, but she suspected he merely tolerated. She wrote about his illness, the small stroke that had weakened his left side, the careful rehabilitation, her role as caregiver. Not the sanitized version society preferred, but the real version. Helping him shower when his balance was unsteady, managing medications, the indignity of aging that he hated, and she witnessed with as much dignity as she could preserve for him. And she wrote about his children, the invitations extended and declined, the grandchildren she'd never met, the tension at the few family gatherings they attended, Bradley's barely concealed resentment, Sloane's performative politeness that never quite reached her eyes, Robert's sadness about it, and his eventual acceptance that some relationships couldn't be forced. But even as she wrote, doubt crept in. Was she remembering accurately, or was grief painting the past in rosy hues, erasing complications, making the marriage better than it had been? Every memory felt suspect now, contaminated by the need to prove rather than simply remember. The community reaction came faster than she'd expected. News of the will contest spread through their social circle like wildfire. Someone at the law firm must have talked, or perhaps Bradley and Sloane were managing the narrative. Within days, Carolyn felt the shift. At the grocery store, former friends suddenly needed to examine produce very carefully when she approached. At the museum board meeting she attended against Frances's advice, conversation stopped when she entered rooms. The museum director, a man she'd worked with for 12 years, suggested gently that perhaps she should take a temporary leave during this difficult time. "We just think it's best," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "For you, of course, all this stress." The subtext was clear. Her presence had become controversial. Board members were taking sides, donors were uncomfortable, and the museum's reputation couldn't afford association with scandal. Carolyn resigned that afternoon, another piece of her identity carved away. The whispers followed her everywhere. At the coffee shop where she and Robert had met every Saturday morning for 15 years, The barista, who'd known their orders by heart, suddenly couldn't remember if Carolyn wanted cream or not. The neighbors, who'd waved cheerfully from their yards, now found reasons to be inside when she drove past. Only Amy remained constant. She appeared at Carolyn's door one evening with Sophie and another casserole. "People are saying mean things about you," Sophie announced with her characteristic bluntness. "But Mama says people who gossip are just bored and should get hobbies." Amy blushed. "Sophie, that's not—" "It's fine," Carolyn said, fighting a smile despite everything. "Your mama is absolutely right. Would you like to help me water the roses?" While Sophie carefully directed the watering can under Carolyn's guidance, Amy sat on the garden bench and spoke quietly. "Someone came by asking questions about you. A private investigator, I think. He wanted to know if Mr. King seemed confused, if you controlled who he saw, if there was anything suspicious about your relationship." Carolyn's hand stilled on the watering can. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to get off my property before I called the police." Amy's voice was fierce. "Miss Carolyn, I saw you and Mr. King together almost every day for 5 years. I saw how he looked at you, how you looked at him. Anyone claiming that was manipulation is either lying or blind." The words were a balm on wounds Carolyn hadn't realized were bleeding. "Thank you. I mean it. And if you need me to testify or write a statement or anything, I will. I don't care if it makes me unpopular. Some things are more important than popularity." After Amy and Sophie left, Carolyn sat in the garden and cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of fighting to prove something she'd never questioned before. That her love had been real, her marriage legitimate, her place in Robert's life earned rather than stolen. If you've ever felt like you had to prove your worth or defend your place in your own life, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because Carolyn's fight is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The deposition was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Jessica prepared Carolyn with the intensity of a coach, training an athlete for the Olympics. They met every other day, Jessica firing questions, Carolyn learning to answer concisely without over-explaining or becoming defensive. "When did you meet Robert King?" "April 2008, at the Riverside Museum of Art." "What was your financial situation at that time?" "Comfortable. I owned my condominium outright and had retirement savings from my career as a gallery curator." "Were you employed when you married Mr. King?" "I was working as a freelance art consultant. I chose to retire after we married so we could travel and spend time together." Over and over, learning to state facts without justification, to answer questions without reading hostility into neutral words. But every practice session left Carolyn exhausted, reliving her marriage as testimony rather than memory. Frances attended some of the prep sessions, offering insight from her years on the bench. "Carver will try to make you angry," she warned. "He'll question your motives, imply things about your character, twist your words. The moment you lose your temper, he wins. Stay calm, stay factual, and remember, the truth is on your side." But what was truth anymore? Carolyn had believed she knew, but weeks of scrutiny had made her question everything. Had she been too controlling? Too involved in Robert's medical care? Had she unconsciously isolated him from his children, or had they isolated themselves? The worst moments came late at night, alone in the house that felt less like home and more like a museum of a life she might lose. She'd find herself in Robert's study, holding his reading glasses, trying to summon his voice from memory. What would he say if he could see what his death had unleashed? She knew, actually. His journal had made it clear. "I only wish I could be there to defend her." But he wasn't there. She had to defend herself, and some days that felt impossible. Then came the article. Carolyn was having coffee with Frances when her phone lit up with texts from multiple people. She opened the first one and felt the blood drain from her face. The society page of the local paper had run a feature, King Estate Battle Highlights, questions about late-life marriages. The article was ostensibly balanced, presenting both sides of the story. But the framing was devastating. It described Bradley as a devoted son concerned about his father's welfare in his final years. Sloane was a loving daughter struggling to honor her father's memory. And Carolyn was described with careful neutrality as Robert King's second wife, married for 15 years to a man 19 years her senior. The age gap was emphasized repeatedly. Her career change after marriage was noted as giving up work to focus on her husband's care. The prenuptial agreement updates were described as unusual and raising questions. The article quoted sources close to the family, suggesting Robert had become increasingly isolated in his final years, dependent on his wife for daily care and decision-making. It mentioned that his children rarely visited, but framed it as concern they weren't welcome. Every fact was technically accurate. The impression was completely false. This is character assassination, Frances said, scanning the article. Bradley or Sloane must have fed them this narrative. At the bottom of the article, in what should have been neutral reporting, was a final paragraph that made Carolyn's stomach turn. Sources indicate that King's romantic history includes a previous relationship with a wealthy older man who died unexpectedly, raising questions about patterns in her personal life. They dug into her first marriage, to Daniel, who died of a heart attack at 48, devastating Carolyn and leaving her nearly broke because his business partner had run the company into debt. The implication was clear. She had a pattern of targeting wealthy older men. "They're building a narrative," Jessica said when Carolyn called her, voice shaking. "This is exactly what I warned you about. They're going to paint you as a serial gold digger. Never mind that you were financially independent before both marriages, or that Daniel's death left you in debt, not wealthy. What do? We respond through legal channels, file a motion, present the actual facts. And Carolyn, don't read the comments." But of course she read the comments. Strangers weighing in on her life, her choices, her marriage. Some defended her, many didn't. The cruelty of anonymous judgment was breathtaking. Old woman probably thought she hit the jackpot. Those poor kids, watching their father get manipulated. Why do wealthy old men keep falling for this? Each comment was a knife, even though she knew she should ignore them. These people didn't know her, didn't know Robert, had no stake in the truth. But their words echoed the fear that had been growing since the will contest began. What if everyone believes the worst about me? That night, Carolyn had her first complete breakdown. Not the controlled tears she'd allowed herself before, but full-body sobs that left her gasping for breath, collapsed on the bathroom floor because she'd made it that far before her legs gave out. Frances found her there an hour later. Carolyn had forgotten to lock the door, and Frances still had a key from years of friendship. Oh, sweetheart. Frances sat on the cold tile beside her, pulled Carolyn against her shoulder, and let her cry. When Carolyn could finally speak, the words tumbled out in a rush. What if they're right? Not about the manipulation, but about, what if I don't deserve this? I didn't give him children. I only knew him 15 years. Bradley and Sloane are his real family, his blood, and I'm just... Stop. Frances's voice was gentle, but firm. Real family isn't biology. It's presence. It's showing up. It's love freely given, not obligation resentfully fulfilled. You were there when he needed someone. They weren't. That's not your fault or your shame. It's theirs. But people believe tabloid gossip and social media lies. People believe what's entertaining, not what's true. You can't live your life trying to convince people who've already made up their minds. Carolyn pulled back, wiping her face with her sleeve like a child. Then what do? You stop trying to prove yourself worthy and start simply stating what's true. You loved Robert. He loved you. You had 15 years of genuine partnership. You don't need to justify that to anyone. Even if it means losing everything? Frances was quiet for a moment. Would you rather have Robert's money and lose your integrity, or lose the money and keep your self-respect? The question hung in the air. Carolyn thought about the settlement offer: $2 million, the house, a comfortable future. All she had to do was walk away, accept the narrative that her marriage was less valid than biology, admit that her 15 years of love counted less than their 40-plus years of genetic connection. "I can't do it," she whispered. "I can't let them erase me, erase us, even if it means I lose everything else." "Then you already know what you have to do." Frances pulled her to her feet. "Now come on, we're going to eat ice cream and make a plan." Over mint chocolate chip eaten straight from the container, they strategized. Jessica would file a response to the article, presenting facts that countered the narrative. They'd gather character witnesses, people who'd known both Robert and Carolyn, who could testify to the marriage's authenticity. They'd request Robert's business records, showing that Bradley and Sloan had been financially dependent on their father for years, despite being adults with no disabilities. And they'd prepare for the deposition, where Carolyn would have to face her accusers and defend her love, while lawyers tried to make it sound like manipulation. "It's going to be brutal," Frances warned. "They'll ask about every aspect of your relationship, your sex life, your arguments, every decision Robert made that benefited you. They'll try to make you look calculating." "I know." "And you're still willing to go through with it?" Carolyn thought about Robert's journal entry. "I only wish I could be there to defend her." He couldn't be there, but she could be there for him, defending his right to make his own choices, to distribute his estate as he wished, to love whom he chose without his children overriding his autonomy. "I'm willing," she said, "not because I think I'll win, but because the alternative is admitting they're right, and they're not." Frances raised her spoon in salute. "That's my girl. Now tell me everything you know about Bradley and Sloan's finances, because if we're going to war, we're not going in unarmed," Carolyn told her. About the job opportunities Robert had given Bradley, at least 3, all at King Industries, all ending in termination for incompetence or inappropriate behavior. About Sloan's consulting company that had no clients except her father. About the advance requests, the loans never repaid, the trust funds accessed early and depleted quickly. Robert tried to teach them responsibility, Carolyn said, but they interpreted every boundary as punishment, every no as favoritism toward me. Did he document any of this? Probably. He was meticulous about business records. Everything went through his accountant and legal team. Then we'll subpoena those records, show that they've been living off Robert's money for years, yet claim you're the financial opportunist. Frances's smile was sharp. They're not going to like that. They wouldn't, but Carolyn was past caring about whether Bradley and Sloan liked her. She'd spent 15 years trying to win their acceptance, making herself smaller to avoid conflict, accepting their rejection with grace because that's what Robert wanted. Robert was gone, and she was done making herself small. The response came within days of Jessica filing their motion. Mitchell Carver released a statement expressing disappointment that Mrs. King was forcing a painful family matter into public litigation rather than accepting a generous settlement. The statement went on to detail the settlement offer, making it sound like they'd offered her millions out of generosity rather than a fraction of what she was legally entitled to. It mentioned Bradley and Sloan's concern for their father's legacy and their reluctance to engage in public battle, but their duty to honor his true wishes. The press ate it up. Another article, another round of public opinion weighing in on her life. But this time, something different happened. Aaron Russo, Robert's business partner and longtime friend, called a press conference. Carolyn watched it on her laptop, Frances beside her, both of them holding their breath. Aaron stood before microphones, 65 years old and radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of success. He'd built King Industries alongside Robert, knew the family intimately, had no financial stake in the estate battle. I'm speaking today because I can't stay silent while Robert King's memory is being distorted, he began. I knew Robert for 40 years. I witnessed his first marriage, his relationship with his children, and his marriage to Carolyn. I'm here to state unequivocally, Robert was completely sound of mind until the day he died. His decisions about his estate were informed, intentional, and entirely his own. Aaron went on to describe Robert's cognitive clarity, his active involvement in business decisions until weeks before his death, his frustration with his children's entitlement. He mentioned the chess games they'd played weekly, games Robert won consistently, sharp strategic thinking intact. And then he dropped the bombshell. Bradley King was employed by King Industries on 3 separate occasions. Each time his father gave him opportunities to prove himself. Each time Bradley's performance was inadequate. He was terminated the final time for sexual harassment of a junior employee, a settlement his father paid quietly to protect the company's reputation. Sloan King ran a consulting firm that had exactly one client, her father. Over 7 years, Robert paid her company $800,000 for services that were never clearly defined or delivered. The room erupted with questions. Aaron answered calmly, methodically, destroying the image of devoted children fighting a predatory stepmother. Robert loved his children, Aaron concluded, but he was disappointed in the adults they'd become. His will reflects that disappointment and his desire to protect the woman who actually stood by him. I'm prepared to testify to all of this under oath. When the press conference ended, Carolyn sat in stunned silence. That, Frances said, is what we call a game changer. Jessica called minutes later, her voice energized. Did you see it? Aaron Russo just handed us our case. Bradley and Sloan's credibility is destroyed. The narrative just shifted from grieving children versus manipulative widow to entitled children, angry the gravy train stopped. I didn't ask him to do that, Carolyn said. I don't want to win because Robert's children are being publicly humiliated. You're not winning because of that. You're winning because the truth is coming out. Robert made choices based on reality. The reality of who his children were, who you were, what he wanted his legacy to be. Aaron just made that reality visible. After she hung up, Carolyn sat with the complicated emotions swirling through her. Relief that someone with credibility was defending her. Sadness that Robert's disappointments in his children were now public knowledge. Guilt that her fight was causing pain, even to people who'd caused her pain first. You're allowed to win, Frances said, reading her expression. You're allowed to be relieved that the truth is coming out. You don't have to feel guilty for Bradley and Sloan facing consequences for their own actions. Robert would hate this. All of it becoming public, his children being embarrassed. Robert knew this would happen. His journal proves it. He chose to protect you anyway, knowing it would cause exactly this kind of battle. Honor that choice. Fight for it. That night, Carolyn returned to the journal, reading through entries she'd skipped before. One jumped out at her, dated 8 months before Robert's death. Had lunch with Aaron today. He asked if I was sure about the will, knowing Bradley and Sloan will fight it. I told him I'm certain. Carolyn earned every penny through 15 years of genuine partnership. My children earned their inheritance through biology alone, which isn't earning at all. If they contest the will, it will prove exactly why I made the decisions I did. They'll show the world who they really are. And maybe, they'll finally learn that entitlement isn't the same as deservedness. I doubt it, though. Some lessons come too late. Robert had known. He'd known they'd fight, known it would be ugly, known Carolyn would have to defend herself publicly, and he'd trusted her to be strong enough. She'd been doubting that strength for weeks. But sitting in his study, holding his words, she felt it return. Not the strength to be perfect or beyond criticism, but the strength to stand firm in truth regardless of who believed her. The deposition was in 2 days. She was as ready as she'd ever be. Chapter 4. The morning of the deposition, Carolyn woke at 4 a.m. and couldn't fall back asleep. She lay in the dark, Robert's side of the bed still untouched. She couldn't bring herself to sleep in the middle, as if leaving his space empty kept him somehow present, and ran through Jessica's coaching one more time. Answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information. Stay calm. Don't let them make you defensive. If you need a break, ask for one. Remember, the truth is on your side. But truth felt like such a fragile defense against the machinery of litigation. Truth could be twisted, reframed, presented in shadows that made it look like lies. She rose at 5, showered with the methodical care of someone preparing for battle. Navy suit, professional, conservative, nothing flashy, minimal makeup. Hair in her usual elegant twist, pearl earrings, wedding ring, watch. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger, a woman armored in respectability, preparing to have her life dissected by hostile strangers. Francis arrived at 7 with coffee and bagels Carolyn couldn't eat. "You're going to be brilliant," Francis said. "Just remember, Carver's going to try to rattle you. That's his job. Don't let him." "What if I can't remember something? What if I say the wrong thing?" "Then you say, 'I don't recall,' and move on. Carolyn, you're not on trial. You're giving testimony. There's a difference." But it didn't feel like a difference. It felt like Judgment Day. Jessica met them at the law offices at 8:30. The deposition would take place in the same conference room where the ambush had occurred. A deliberate choice, Carolyn suspected, meant to remind her of that first defeat. She walked into the room with her head high and her stomach churning. Bradley and Sloan were already seated with Mitchell Carver. A court reporter sat ready, fingers poised over her stenography machine. The whole thing felt surreal, reducing 15 years of love to a legal transcript. "Good morning, Mrs. King," Carver said with false pleasantness. "Thank you for being here today." As if she'd had a choice. Carolyn was sworn in, promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. She touched her wedding ring, a talisman, a reminder of why she was here, and nodded that she was ready. Carver started easy. Name, age, current address, where she was born, where she grew up, her education. He built a foundation of basic facts before moving to more dangerous territory. "Ms. King, you were previously married, is that correct?" "Yes, to Daniel Porter. We were married for 8 years before his death." "And how did Mr. Porter die?" "Heart attack. He was 48. "That must have been quite a shock." "It was devastating." "And after his death, did you inherit his estate?" Jessica interjected. "Relevance?" "Goes to establishing a pattern, Your Honor. Excuse me, Ms. Moreno. This isn't a courtroom." Carver smiled. "Mrs. King, did you inherit from your first husband?" "No, Daniel's business partner had run up significant debts. The estate was insolvent. I received nothing." "I see. So you were, what, 50 years old, widowed, with no inheritance?" 52, and I had my own savings and my condominium." "But you were working at that time, correct? As a gallery curator?" "Yes." "Making approximately what salary?" Jessica objected, but Carolyn answered, "Approximately $70,000 per year, plus commission on acquisitions." "And 6 years later, you met Robert King, worth approximately $8 million. That must have been quite fortunate." The implication hung in the air, ugly and obvious. Carolyn kept her voice steady. "I didn't know Robert's net worth when I met him. We talked about art, not finances." "But you did learn about his wealth eventually." "Of course. We were in a relationship. Such things come up naturally." "And when did they come up naturally? First date? First month?" "When you were deciding whether to pursue the relationship," Jessica interrupted again. "Asked and answered. Move on, Mr. Carver." Carver shifted tactics. "Mrs. King, when did you and Robert King begin dating?" "April 2008. "And when did he propose?" "February 2009. Rather quick, wasn't it? 10 months? We were both adults in our 50s. We knew what we wanted. And what did you want, Mrs. King? The question was a trap. If she said love, she sounded naive. If she said companionship, she sounded calculating. If she said security, she'd proven their case. I wanted Robert, she said simply. His company, his conversation, his presence in my life. His wealth didn't factor into your decision? Everyone's financial situation factors into marriage decisions. Robert and I discussed it openly. We signed a prenuptial agreement to protect both our interests. Yes, let's discuss that prenuptial agreement. Carver slid a document across the table. This is the original prenup signed 2 weeks before your wedding, correct? Carolyn glanced at it. Yes. It stipulates that in the event of divorce, you would receive $500,000 and no claim on his estate. In the event of his death, you would receive $1 million and the right to live in the marital home for 2 years. Is that accurate? Yes. Quite different from what you're claiming now, isn't it? The prenuptial agreement was updated twice during our marriage, at Robert's insistence. His insistence, of course. Carver's skepticism was palpable. Mrs. King, isn't it true that after each update, you received substantially more? The updates reflected the evolving nature of our partnership. Robert wanted the agreement to reflect what we were building together. Or you convinced him to give you more each time. Objection, Jessica said sharply. That's not a question, it's an accusation. I'll rephrase. Mrs. King, who initiated the discussions about updating the prenuptial agreement. Carolyn took a breath. This was the crucial point. Robert did. Both times. He approached me, said the agreement no longer reflected our marriage, and wanted to ensure I was protected if something happened to him. Protected from what? From exactly this. He told me his children would contest his will. He wanted me to have legal protection. Bradley shifted in his seat, jaw clenched. Sloane's eyes narrowed. Convenient that he's not here to confirm that story, Carver said. It's not a story. It's the truth. And it's documented in the legal correspondence with his attorney. Carver moved on, but Carolyn could see she'd scored a point. The updated prenuptial agreements hadn't been hidden. They'd been properly executed with legal counsel, creating a paper trail that supported her version of events. Mrs. King, let's discuss Robert's health. When was his stroke? June 2013. And after the stroke, you became his primary caregiver? Yes. You managed his medications? Yes. Coordinated his medical appointments? Yes. Decided what activities he could participate in? I facilitated his care based on doctors' recommendations. You were with him constantly, weren't you? I was his wife. Where else would I be? His children might say you were isolating him. His children were welcome anytime. I invited them repeatedly. But they didn't visit often, did they? No. Why do you think that was? Carolyn paused. This was dangerous ground. Anything negative she said about Bradley and Sloane would be used to paint her as turning Robert against his children. You'd have to ask them, she said carefully. I'm asking you. Why do you think Robert's children rarely visited their father in his final years? I don't know. I can only say they were always welcome in our home. But you were always there, weren't you? Making them uncomfortable? Making them feel like outsiders in their father's life? I was there because I lived there. It was my home, too. A home that Robert owned before you married him. A home we shared for 15 years. Carver leaned forward. Mrs. King, isn't it true that you deliberately kept Robert's children at a distance so you could manipulate him without interference? No, that's absolutely false. Isn't it true that you screened his phone calls? I answered the phone because I was home. If someone called for Robert, I transferred the call. Every time? Unless he was sleeping or unavailable. Then I took messages. Messages you delivered? Of course. How do we know you delivered all the messages? How do we know you didn't filter what information reached Robert? Jessica stood. This is outrageous speculation. Unless you have evidence that Mrs. King intercepted communications, I'm establishing a pattern of control, Carver interrupted. Mrs. King, yes or no, were you the primary gatekeeper for Robert's communications in his final years? I answered the phone. I'm not a gatekeeper. I'm a wife. A wife who inherited millions after cutting her husband off from his family. I didn't cut him off from anyone. His children chose not to visit. Because you made them unwelcome. That's not true. Then why? Carver softened his voice as if genuinely puzzled. Why would loving children stay away from their dying father? And there it was. The question designed to make her either accuse Bradley and Sloan of being uncaring, proving she'd poisoned Robert against them, or accept that she'd driven them away. Carolyn looked at Bradley and Sloan, at their faces, carefully arranged in expressions of wounded innocence, and she thought of Robert's journal entries, of the documented evidence of their absence, their financial dependency, their years of disappointment. I can't speak to their motivations, she said quietly. I can only tell you that I invited them repeatedly, that Robert wanted a relationship with them, that their absence hurt him. If you want to know why they stayed away, ask them. But don't blame me for choices they made. Carver's eyes flashed. He'd wanted her to attack them directly. Instead, she'd put the burden back on them to explain their own behavior. The questions continued for 3 more hours. About money. Who managed the household finances? Who made investment decisions? What Robert spent on her versus his children? About health care. Every medication, every doctor's visit, every decision made during his illness. About their daily life. What they talked about. How they spent their time, whether Robert seemed happy or confused or manipulated. With each question, Carolyn felt pieces of her privacy stripped away. The intimate details of their marriage, his fear of becoming dependent, her patience when he needed help showering, the conversations about death and legacy, all of it rendered clinical and suspicious under Carver's questioning. Finally, mercifully, they reached the point where Carolyn could give her own testimony rather than simply respond to accusations. Mrs. King, Jessica said gently, I'd like you to tell us about your relationship with Robert, not the legal facts, but the truth of your marriage. What was it like to be married to Robert King? And something in Carolyn broke open, not the careful composure she'd maintained for hours, but the genuine emotion she'd been holding back. It was like coming home, she said, her voice thick. I didn't realize I'd been lonely until I met him. We could sit in comfortable silence for hours, reading, just being together. Or we'd argue about books, politics, art, real arguments where we challenged each other. He made me think. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen. She looked at Bradley and Sloan, needing them to hear this even if they'd never believe it. Your father's favorite breakfast was soft-boiled eggs and wheat toast. He liked his newspaper folded in thirds. He hummed off-key when he cooked, always the same song, What a Wonderful World. He was terrified of thunderstorms because lightning hit a tree near his bedroom when he was 7. He reread East of Eden every autumn because it reminded him of his grandfather. He had terrible taste in jokes, but told them anyway because making me groan made him happy. The specificity was overwhelming, detail after detail that only genuine intimacy would reveal. We had a standing argument about Rothko versus Pollock, who better captured chaos. He said Pollock, I said Rothko. We debated it for 3 years. He finally conceded the month before he died, and I knew it was because he was dying, because Robert King never conceded anything he didn't truly believe. Carolyn's voice cracked, but she pushed forward. He worried about you, she said to Bradley and Sloan, kept your childhood photos on his desk, mentioned you in his prayers, hoped until the end that you'd come around, that you'd see him as more than money. He updated his will not to punish you, but to reflect reality, that I was his partner, his companion, the person who showed up every day for 15 years. She turned back to the court reporter, the official record. "I didn't manipulate your father. I loved him. I was there when he woke up, afraid in the night, when his hand shook trying to button his shirt and he was so frustrated he cried, when he forgot words and thought he was losing his mind, when he needed someone to just sit with him in silence because talking was too hard. Where were you?" The question hung in the air. Bradley's jaw worked. Sloane looked away. "I don't need to justify my love," Carolyn continued, her voice stronger. "I don't need to prove I earned the right to my own marriage. Robert knew what he wanted. He documented it carefully, updated it deliberately, and made his wishes absolutely clear. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to defend his right to choose how his life's work is distributed, and I won't apologize for being the person he chose." When she finished, the room was silent except for the soft clicking of the court reporter's machine. Jessica's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. Even Carver seemed momentarily at a loss. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Very touching, Mrs. King. I'm sure you believe every word. The question is whether Robert King was in a position to believe it too, or whether he was so dependent on your care that he simply told you what you wanted to hear." But the power of that accusation had diminished. Carolyn had just demonstrated a level of intimate knowledge, of specific details, daily routines, private fears, that no opportunist could fake. She'd shown the shape of their life together, and it was real in a way that transcended legal definitions. After the deposition ended, Carolyn walked out of the building and stood in the late afternoon sun, feeling simultaneously exhausted and strangely liberated. She'd done it. She'd defended her marriage, her love, her truth. Whether anyone believed her remained to be seen, but she'd stated the reality of her life without apology. Frances pulled her into a fierce hug. "You were magnificent. I felt like I was being filleted." "You were, but you didn't break. And Carolyn, you didn't just defend yourself. You testified to something real. Anyone listening could hear it." Jessica joined them, briefcase in hand and satisfied smile on her face. "That was perfect. You gave us exactly what we needed, genuine emotion, specific details, and you put Bradley and Sloane on notice that their own behavior is fair game. Carver's going to think twice about painting them as devoted children after that." "Will it be enough?" Carolyn asked. "It's a start. And tomorrow, Aaron Russo gives his deposition. After his press conference, Carver's going to have a hard time rehabilitating Bradley and Sloane's image." That night, back home, Carolyn poured herself a large glass of wine and sat in Robert's study. She pulled out his journal and read the entries she'd turned to repeatedly these past weeks. "I know they'll contest it. I know Carolyn will have to defend our love to strangers who never saw us together, never witnessed the life we built. I only wish I could be there to defend her. But she's stronger than she knows. She'll stand up for herself, for us, for the truth. I have to believe that." Tears ran down Carolyn's face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. She'd stood up. She'd found the strength Robert believed she had. And whether she won or lost the legal battle, she'd already won something more important: the right to claim her own story, to refuse erasure, to insist that her love had been real even if others chose not to believe it. She raised her wine glass to Robert's photo. "I stood up for us today," she whispered, "just like you knew I would." Chapter 5. 6 weeks into the legal battle, Carolyn woke to her phone buzzing with notifications. Dozens of them. Text messages, emails, missed calls. Her stomach clenched. Nothing good ever came from this kind of digital avalanche. She opened the first text from a museum board member she hadn't heard from in weeks. "I'm so sorry you're going through this." The next was from a former colleague. "For what it's worth, I never believed it." Believed what? Carolyn opened her email and found the answer. Mitchell Carver had filed a pre-trial brief, and somehow, leaked, she suspected deliberately, it had made its way to several media outlets. The headlines were brutal. King widow's pattern revealed, 2 wealthy older men, 2 convenient deaths, estate battle uncovers, questions about previous marriage, gold digger or grieving widow, King family presents evidence. With shaking hands, Carolyn downloaded the brief. It was 30 pages of character assassination disguised as legal argument. Her entire life, reframed as a predator's resume. Her first marriage to Daniel was presented with sinister implications. Yes, he died of a heart attack, but the brief emphasized that she'd been the one to find him, the one who'd waited 20 minutes before calling 911. Never mind that she'd been in shock, that those 20 minutes felt like 20 seconds, that the paramedics had confirmed nothing could have saved him. The brief made it sound suspicious. Her career as a gallery curator was recast as access to wealthy clientele. Her freelance consulting was described as strategic positioning in elite social circles. Even her volunteer work at the museum was framed as cultivating relationships with wealthy donors. Every relationship she'd ever had was listed, researched, evaluated for the man's financial status. An old boyfriend from her 30s who'd been an investment banker, a brief romance in her 20s with a lawyer. Each one presented as evidence of a pattern. Carolyn King targets successful men. But the most devastating section detailed her marriage to Robert. Every kindness was reframed as manipulation, reading to him when his eyes were tired, isolating him from other influences, managing his medications, controlling his mental state, encouraging him to rest rather than attend stressful business meetings, cutting him off from his support system. The prenuptial agreement updates were presented as a smoking gun. Within 2 years of marriage, defendant convinced decedent to triple her potential inheritance. Within 5 years, she'd secured primary beneficiary status on all accounts. Within 8 years, she'd effectively written his biological children out of their rightful inheritance. And there, in black and white, the accusation that made Carolyn's blood run cold. Defendant's pattern of relationships with wealthy older men who die under her care raises serious questions about her intentions and potentially her actions. They were implying, not quite stating, but clearly implying, that she'd somehow caused Robert's death, that she was more than a gold digger, that she was dangerous. Carolyn made it to the bathroom before she vomited. She knelt on the cold tile, her body heaving, her mind reeling. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. They were destroying her, painting her as a monster, suggesting she'd murdered 2 husbands for money. Her phone rang. Jessica. "Don't read the comments," Jessica said immediately. "I know you probably already have, but stop. Carolyn, this is beyond the pale. I'm filing an emergency motion. This is defamation, and Carver knows it. He leaked this deliberately to poison public opinion before trial. They're saying I killed him." Carolyn's voice was hollow. "They're saying I killed Robert. They're implying it without evidence, which is actionable. We're going to destroy them for this. But right now, I need you to not engage. Don't respond to media. Don't read social media. Don't answer unknown numbers." After Jessica hung up, Carolyn sat on the bathroom floor and stared at nothing. This was it. This was the cost of fighting. Not just money or privacy, but her entire reputation, her entire life reduced to a tabloid nightmare. The doorbell rang, then rang again and again. She ignored it until she heard Francis's voice. "Carolyn King, I know you're in there. Open this door or I'm calling the fire department to break it down." Carolyn opened the door. Francis took one look at her and pulled her into a crushing embrace. "I read it," Francis said. "All of it. It's lies, sweetheart. Vicious, calculated lies. But people will believe it. They're already believing it." Francis steered her to the couch, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders like she was a child. "Some people will believe it because people love scandal, but the people who matter, who know you, we know the truth." "Do you?" The question came out harsher than Carolyn intended. "Do you really know? Because I'm starting to wonder if I know anything anymore. What if I was controlling? What if I did isolate him? What if everything I thought was love was actually... Stop. Francis's voice was sharp. That's exactly what they want. They want you doubting yourself, questioning your own memories, believing their version of events. Don't give them that power. But the power was already taken. Carolyn could feel it, her certainty eroding, her memories contaminated, her understanding of her own life fractured by the persistent voice of accusation. Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up, then regional, then, somehow, national outlets. Small-town estate battle reveals questions about widows' past. The narrative was irresistible. Wealthy man, younger woman, suspicious circumstances, family fighting back. Carolyn's phone rang constantly, reporters wanting statements, former acquaintances seeking gossip, strangers calling to share their opinions about her guilt or innocence. She stopped answering. She stopped checking email. She stopped leaving the house. The museum board requested her immediate resignation from all volunteer positions. The garden club disinvited her from the spring gala. The country club, where she'd maintained membership even after Robert's death, sent a formal letter suggesting she might be more comfortable elsewhere during this difficult time. She was being erased from polite society, expelled from the community she'd been part of for 15 years. And the worst part was understanding why. No one wanted to be associated with scandal. Whether she was guilty or innocent mattered less than the simple fact of controversy. On the third day, Amy appeared at the door. Carolyn almost didn't answer, but Amy's voice was insistent. "Miss Carolyn, I brought dinner, and I'm not leaving until you let me in." Inside, Amy unpacked containers of soup and bread. She didn't mention the news coverage, the leaked brief, any of it. She just set the table and dished out food and talked about Sophie's school play and the neighbor's new puppy and normal, mundane, life-affirming things. Finally, Carolyn broke. "You shouldn't be here. Being seen with me, it'll hurt you. People will think..." "I don't care what people think. I care about you." Amy's voice was fierce. "Miss Carolyn, I was served with a subpoena. They want me to testify." Carolyn's stomach dropped. "Amy, no, don't. Protect yourself and Sophie. This isn't your fight." "That's the thing. It is my fight. Not legally, but morally. I watched you and Mr. King together for 5 years. I saw real love, real partnership, and I'm not going to sit silently while they destroy you with lies. They'll come after you. They'll dig into your life, question your motives. Let them. I have nothing to hide. And even if I did, some things are more important than protecting yourself." Amy reached across the table and gripped Carolyn's hand. "You taught me that. Watching you fight for yourself, refuse to accept their settlement, stand up even when it costs you everything, that taught me something important. I'm standing up too." After Amy left, Carolyn cried for the first time since reading the brief. Not tears of despair, but of gratitude. She'd lost so much: reputation, community, peace. But she'd gained something too. The knowledge of who stood with her when standing was costly. That night, she forced herself to open her laptop. Jessica had sent over the motion she'd filed, a blistering response to Carver's brief, accusing him of defamation, professional misconduct, and deliberately prejudicing the case by leaking inflammatory allegations without evidence. Carolyn read through it with grim satisfaction. Jessica was pulling no punches. She demanded sanctions. She called out specific false statements. And she did something Carolyn hadn't expected. She went after Bradley and Sloane's finances. The motion included documentation Jessica had subpoenaed, employment records from King Industries showing Bradley's 3 terminations, financial records showing Sloane's shell company, evidence of loans and gifts totaling over $2 million given to the children in the decade before Robert's death. While plaintiffs claim concern about defendants' influence over decedent's financial decisions, Jessica wrote, the record shows they were the primary beneficiaries of his generosity during his lifetime. They received millions while contributing nothing. Their concern about the will appears less about protecting their father's wishes and more about protecting their own financial interests. It was brutal and true, and exactly the kind of counterattack that could shift the narrative if anyone was still willing to listen to Carolyn's side. The next morning, Carolyn woke to find Frances already in her kitchen, making coffee. "How did you get in?" "I still have a key, and I'm moving in until this is over." "Frances, don't argue, you're not doing this alone." Frances poured 2 cups, handed one to Carolyn. "Jessica's motion is getting attention. Some of the outlets that ran the initial story are now covering the financial records. The narrative is shifting." "Shifting how?" "From predatory widow to greedy children angry the trust fund dried up." Frances pulled up articles on her tablet. "Look, king children receive millions before contesting father's will. Estate battle reveals history of financial dependence." This one's my favorite. "Who's really after the money?" Carolyn scanned the articles. They were more balanced than the initial coverage, questioning Bradley and Sloane's motivations, noting the financial records Jessica had uncovered. But the damage was done. Even sympathetic coverage included phrases like the controversial widow and questions about her past. "I'm ruined," Carolyn said quietly. "Even if I win, I'm ruined. Everyone will always wonder if I manipulated him, if I killed him." "Then you're free," Frances said. Carolyn looked at her, confused. "Think about it," Frances continued. "You've spent 15 years trying to be accepted by a community that never fully welcomed you, trying to win over stepchildren who never intended to be won, trying to prove you deserved a place in Robert's life. And now the worst has happened. They've said every ugly thing they could think of, dragged your name through the mud, painted you as a monster, and you're still here. Barely, but here. Which means you survived the worst they could do. You're free to stop trying to convince them, stop seeking their approval, stop caring what they think. You can just be." Carolyn let those words sink in. Was Frances right? Was there freedom in having nothing left to lose? That afternoon, the attorney for Robert's estate, a neutral party responsible for administering the will regardless of the contest, called with unexpected news. "Mrs. King, I'm required to inform you of all material discoveries during the administration process. Our forensic accountant has completed his review of Mr. King's financial records." "And?" "There are some irregularities, specifically approximately $300,000 in unexplained withdrawals from Mr. King's business accounts over a 5-year period. The withdrawals were authorized by Bradley King, who had limited signing authority for operational expenses. These withdrawals appear to be personal rather than business-related." Carolyn's mind raced. What does that mean? It means Bradley King may have been embezzling from his father's company. We're obligated to report this to the court. It significantly undermines his credibility as a plaintiff claiming concern about financial manipulation. After the call, Carolyn sat in stunned silence. Bradley hadn't just been financially dependent on Robert, he'd been stealing from him, and now that theft was about to become part of the court record. She called Jessica immediately. "I know," Jessica said, barely containing excitement. "The estate attorney copied me on the report. Carolyn, this changes everything. Bradley's entire case rests on claiming you manipulated Robert financially. Meanwhile, he was literally stealing from his father's company. The hypocrisy is staggering. Will this be made public? It'll be part of the court filings. And yes, it'll leak, just like their brief leaked. The difference is, this time, the truth is on our side." Carolyn's fight reminds us that our worth isn't determined by who believes in us. It's determined by whether we believe in ourselves. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about your own power, let me know in the comments. Share your own moments of standing up, claiming space, refusing to shrink. And don't forget to subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories, because every woman's journey to empowerment deserves to be told and celebrated. 2 days later, the story broke. King's son accused of embezzlement during father's lifetime. The article detailed Bradley's unauthorized withdrawals, his pattern of financial irresponsibility, and the investigation now underway into potential criminal charges. The court of public opinion shifted overnight. Bradley's holier-than-thou image crumbled. Sloane, associated with her brother's crimes by proximity and shared lawsuit, faced renewed scrutiny. Their attorney, Mitchell Carver, issued a statement calling the embezzlement claims unsubstantiated and a desperate attempt to distract from the real issue of undue influence. But the damage was done. Bradley had been stealing from his father while accusing Carolyn of financial manipulation. The irony was too perfect to ignore. Carolyn watched the news coverage with complicated emotions. She felt vindicated. Finally, people were questioning Bradley and Sloane's motives, but she also felt sad. This was Robert's son, revealed as a thief. Robert's legacy, tarnished by his own children's greed and dishonesty. None of this was what he would have wanted. That evening, sitting in Robert's study, Carolyn opened his journal to an entry she hadn't read before, dated just 3 months before his death. Bradley called today asking for money again. I refused. He was angry, said I'm being unfair, favoring Carolyn over my own blood. I tried to explain that I've given him every opportunity, that at some point he needs to stand on his own feet. He hung up on me. Later, Aaron mentioned some discrepancies in the business accounts. Withdrawals Bradley authorized that don't match any project expenses. I should investigate, but I'm tired. So tired of fighting my own children. Carolyn says I should rest, not stress about things I can't control. She's right. I'm going to let it go. Some battles aren't worth fighting when you don't have much time left. Tears streamed down Carolyn's face. Robert had known. He'd known Bradley was stealing, and he'd chosen not to pursue it. Chosen peace over justice, rest over confrontation. And now his choice was being made public, his son's betrayal exposed not by Robert's intention, but by the lawsuit itself. I'm sorry, she whispered to his photo. I know you didn't want this, but they left me no choice. The next week brought an unexpected visitor, Sloane. Carolyn opened the door to find Robert's daughter standing on her porch. No lawyer in sight, eyes red from crying. Real crying, not performance. I need to talk to you, Sloane said. Please. Every instinct told Carolyn to refuse. This was a trap, or a setup, or another manipulation. But something in Sloane's face, genuine distress, not calculated tears, made her step aside. They sat in the living room, awkward silence stretching between them. Finally, Sloane spoke. I didn't know. About Bradley embezzling, I swear I didn't know. Okay. He told me Dad was confused, that you were controlling him, that we needed to contest the will to honor Dad's real wishes. I believed him, because... Sloane's voice broke. Because it was easier than admitting the truth. What truth? That I was a terrible daughter, that I stayed away because Dad made me feel guilty about my choices, my spending, my life, that I resented him for not just giving me money without judgment, that when you came along and he seemed happy, I hated you for it. Not because you were bad for him, but because you reminded me that I wasn't enough. Carolyn sat very still, afraid that any movement would break this moment of honesty. I convinced myself you'd manipulated him, Sloane continued, because if you manipulated him, then his disappointment in me wasn't my fault. It was your influence, your poison. But reading his journal entries in the court filings, she wiped her eyes. He wasn't manipulated. He was just disappointed. In me, in Bradley, in the people we became. He loved you, Carolyn said quietly. He always loved you. I know. That's what makes it worse. He loved us, and I threw it away for money, for the promise of inheritance. I never called just to talk, never visited just to spend time with him. Every interaction was transactional, and you weren't. Sloane stood, pulled an envelope from her purse. This is a letter to my attorney. I'm withdrawing from the lawsuit. I'm not contesting the will anymore. Carolyn took the envelope, stunned. Why? Because Dad knew what he wanted, and because fighting this has cost me the last shred of dignity I had left. I'm not like Bradley. I don't want to be the person stealing from my father and then accusing someone else of manipulation. I just want— Her voice cracked. I just want to stop being the person who disappointed him. After Sloan left, Carolyn sat holding the envelope for a long time. One of the plaintiffs withdrawing didn't end the case. Bradley could continue alone, but it fractured their united front, undermined their narrative of concerned children, and shifted the dynamics entirely. She called Jessica, who was stunned and immediately suspicious. It could be strategy, making Sloan look sympathetic, positioning her as the reasonable one while Bradley takes the fall. Maybe, Carolyn said, but I don't think so. I think she's genuinely tired. Tired of fighting, tired of lying, tired of being someone she doesn't want to be. Well, regardless of her motives, this helps us enormously. A plaintiff withdrawing is a strong signal that the case lacks merit. That night, Carolyn didn't sleep. She thought about Sloan's visit, about the woman who'd left looking smaller, somehow diminished by her own admissions. She thought about Robert, who died hoping his children would change, would grow, would become people he could be proud of. Sloan was trying. Too late for Robert to see it, but trying nonetheless. Bradley, meanwhile, doubled down. He issued a statement through his attorney calling Sloan a traitor who'd been manipulated by Carolyn just like their father had been. He vowed to continue the fight, to expose the truth, to protect his father's legacy. The statement made him look desperate and isolated. Public opinion, which had been split, now tilted, decisively against him. The man accusing his stepmother of financial manipulation while facing embezzlement charges himself. The hypocrisy was too much for even his supporters to defend. But Bradley had nothing left to lose. And that, Frances warned, made him dangerous. Desperate people do desperate things, she said. Watch your back. Change your locks. Vary your routine. I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm already scared. Frances squeezed her hand. Good. Scared keeps you careful. The fear was justified. That week, Carolyn received anonymous letters. Not the first she'd gotten, but these were different, more specific, more threatening. You'll pay for what you did. Murderer, we know where you live. She reported them to the police, who filed a report but offered little hope of finding the sender. She installed a security system. She asked Amy to stop visiting. Too risky, too dangerous to involve a young mother and child in whatever this was becoming. But Amy refused. I'm not abandoning you because some coward sends threatening letters. The trial date was set. 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to prepare, to gather final evidence, to steel herself for the ultimate confrontation. 6 weeks of living in siege mode, waiting for the next attack, the next revelation, the next wound. Carolyn had never been more exhausted, or more certain that she was doing the right thing. Chapter 6. 2 weeks before trial, Carolyn woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. She froze in bed, heart hammering, ears straining. Another crash, then another. Someone was downstairs. With shaking hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911, whispering her address and situation while crawling into the closet. Ridiculous, childish, but some primal instinct demanded hiding. The dispatcher stayed on the line, her calm voice a lifeline in the darkness, promising police were en route. The crashes continued, glass shattering, objects hitting walls. Then silence. Heavy, threatening silence, broken only by Carolyn's ragged breathing and the dispatcher's steady reassurances. Police arrived within 5 minutes. It felt like hours. They found Carolyn still in the closet, phone clutched to her chest, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. The damage was extensive. Every window on the ground floor had been smashed. Robert's study was destroyed, books torn from shelves, desk drawers emptied, papers scattered. His photo was on the floor, frame shattered, and spray-painted across the wall in red letters, "Murderer." The police took statements, photographs, fingerprints. They found no signs of forced entry beyond the broken windows. Whoever had done this had been methodical, breaking in at a back window where they wouldn't be seen from the street. Professional, the officer said, or at least planned carefully. Any idea who might have done this? Carolyn almost laughed. Where would she start? Bradley, angry about losing the lawsuit? Someone who'd read the tabloid coverage and decided to take justice into their own hands? A random vandal who saw an empty-looking house? "I'm in the middle of an estate contest," she said. "It's been contentious." The officer's expression shifted to recognition. He'd read about the case. Everyone had. "We'll increase patrols in your neighborhood," he said. "But Mrs. King, you might want to consider staying somewhere else for a while, at least until the trial is over." After the police left, Frances arrived. Carolyn had called her from the back of the police car and took one look at the destruction before making a decision. "You're staying with me. Not up for debate. We'll pack a bag and you're leaving this house until we can make it secure." "I can't just abandon." "You can and you will. Carolyn, someone broke into your home and destroyed Robert's study. That's not random vandalism. That's a message. And I'm not letting you stay here to receive the next one." By dawn, Carolyn was installed in Frances's guest room, a bag of hastily packed clothes on the floor, her hands still shaking every time she closed her eyes and saw that word painted on the wall, "Murderer." The break-in made the news, of course. More coverage, more speculation. Some outlets suggested it proved Carolyn's guilt. She'd destroyed evidence herself and staged a break-in to appear victimized. Others suggested Bradley was behind it, escalating his campaign beyond the courtroom. The truth was, no one knew, and the not knowing was almost worse than certainty. Jessica filed an emergency motion requesting additional security measures and suggesting the break-in was evidence of witness intimidation. The judge granted a restraining order prohibiting Bradley from coming within 500 feet of Carolyn, though proving he'd been behind the break-in was impossible without evidence. Bradley's attorney issued a statement expressing shock and concern about the incident and insisting his client had nothing to do with it. The statement felt hollow, performative, designed to create plausible deniability rather than actual sympathy. At Frances's house, Carolyn tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She reviewed documents Jessica needed for trial. She practiced testimony. She attempted to eat, sleep, function like a person rather than a collection of raw nerves and exhaustion. But normalcy was impossible. Every sound made her jump. Every car that slowed near the house sent her pulse racing. She'd startle awake at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., The image of that spray-painted accusation burned into her vision. "You're having a trauma response," Frances said gently. "You should talk to someone, a therapist, a counselor. I don't have time. The trial is in 12 days. "Carolyn, if you go into that courtroom like this, shaking, sleep-deprived, traumatized, you won't be able to testify effectively." "Then I'll fake it. I've been faking fine for months." But she couldn't fake it. The stress manifested, physically. Her blood pressure spiked, her hands developed a tremor. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. When she looked in the mirror, a stranger looked back, hollow-eyed, gaunt, aged 10 years in 10 weeks. A week before trial, Carolyn collapsed. She was reviewing documents at Frances's kitchen table when the room started spinning. The papers blurred. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't... Frances's face appeared above her, concern etched in every line. "Breathe with me. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. But Carolyn couldn't. The panic attack, because that's what this was, her second in as many months, had its claws in deep. Her heart raced, her vision narrowed to pinpoints, and distantly she heard Frances calling 911 again. At the hospital, a doctor who looked far too young to have completed medical school explained that she'd had a severe panic attack, complicated by exhaustion and high blood pressure. He wanted to admit her overnight for observation. "I can't," Carolyn said. "I have a trial next week. I need to prepare." "Mrs. King, with all due respect, you're running yourself into the ground. Your body is telling you it can't sustain this level of stress. If you don't slow down, you'll have a real medical emergency. Stroke, heart attack, complete breakdown. Is this trial worth dying for?" The question hung in the air. Was it worth dying for? Lying in the sterile hospital bed, hooked to monitors that beeped with every heartbeat, Carolyn considered it. Really considered it. She could accept the settlement offer, assuming Bradley would even honor it at this point. She could walk away with something rather than risk everything. She could move to another city, start over somewhere her name wasn't synonymous with scandal and suspicion. She could let Robert's children have their version of history, stop fighting to claim her place in his story. She could survive, physically, financially, just not as herself. Because walking away meant accepting their narrative, meant agreeing implicitly that her love had been manipulation, her marriage invalid, her 15 years with Robert less real than his children's biological claim, meant disappearing quietly, erasing herself, becoming the woman they'd tried to make her, inconsequential, illegitimate, unworthy. Frances arrived at the hospital with Carolyn's phone, dozens of messages awaiting. One was from Jessica, marked urgent. Carolyn opened it with dread. Another revelation? Another attack? It was actually good news. Aaron Russo had expedited his deposition, providing detailed testimony about Robert's mental acuity, his explicit wishes regarding the will, and Bradley's history of financial irresponsibility. Combined with the embezzlement evidence and Sloane's withdrawal, Jessica believed they had a strong case. But there was a catch. The testimony was damning for Bradley, painting him as incompetent, dishonest, and motivated purely by greed. Jessica warned that he'd likely respond aggressively. "Be prepared for him to escalate," the message read. "Desperate people become dangerous. Are you sure you want to continue?" Carolyn stared at the question. Was she sure? She thought about Robert's journal. "I only wish I could be there to defend her." She thought about Amy's courage in agreeing to testify despite risks to her own security. She thought about Frances, who'd put her own life on hold to support her friend through this nightmare. She thought about every woman who'd ever been told her love wasn't valid. Her partnership didn't count. Her claim to her own life was suspicious. And she knew. She couldn't stop now. Not because she was certain of winning, but because stopping meant validating everything they'd accused her of. Stopping meant agreeing she was wrong to have loved Robert, wrong to have married him, wrong to exist in her own story. She texted Jessica back, "I'm sure. Let's finish this." The doctor released her the next morning with stern warnings about stress management, blood pressure medication, and the importance of self-care. Frances drove her back to the house, now equipped with new windows, a state-of-the-art security system, and cameras at every entrance. The study was still in disarray. Carolyn stood in the doorway looking at the destruction, the scattered papers, the broken frame that had held Robert's photo. "We can clean this later," Frances said gently. "You don't have to deal with it now." But Carolyn walked in, knelt among the debris, and began gathering papers. Robert's words, scattered but not destroyed, his thoughts, his memories, his documentation of their life together. The vandal had tried to destroy evidence, but had only created more work for themselves. Every scattered page could be recovered, reorganized, presented at trial. She found the photo, Robert's smiling face behind cracked glass. She carefully removed it from the broken frame and held it to her chest. "I'm not giving up," she whispered. "They can break my windows and paint lies on my walls and call me every name they can think of. But I'm not giving up on us." 5 days before trial, Mitchell Carver called an unexpected meeting. He wanted to discuss settlement one more time. "Given recent developments," he said carefully, "my client is willing to make a final offer." Jessica and Carolyn sat across from him, united front, both wary of whatever trick this might be. Mr. King is prepared to offer $3 million, the house and neutral language in the settlement agreement. In exchange, Mrs. King withdraws all claims and agrees not to discuss the case publicly. $3 million, nearly half the estate, more than the original offer, more than Carolyn had ever expected to receive. "And what does Bradley get?" Carolyn asked. "The remainder of the estate and closure on this painful chapter." "No." The word came out before Jessica could interject with legal strategy. "Tell Bradley I'm not interested in his money. I want what Robert left me, all of it. Not because I need the money, but because it was Robert's choice, his decision, his right to distribute his estate as he wished. And I won't let his son override that decision just because biology entitles him to nothing." Carver's expression hardened. "Mrs. King, I should warn you. If this goes to trial and you lose, you could end up with nothing. The judge could rule against you entirely. You'd be responsible for legal fees on both sides. You could lose everything, including the house." "Then I'll lose everything, but I won't surrender." Carolyn stood, Jessica following her lead. "Tell Bradley to see me in court. We're done negotiating." Outside the office, Jessica gripped her arm. "Are you absolutely sure? That was a good offer. $3 million is enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." "I know, but I'm not fighting for comfortable. I'm fighting for the truth." Carolyn looked at her attorney. This woman who'd become more than a lawyer had become an ally and friend. "Can we win?" "Honestly, I think so. We have Robert's journal, medical records proving his mental capacity, witness testimony, evidence of Bradley's financial crimes, and Sloane's withdrawal. We have a strong case. But no guarantees. No, never guarantees in court. But Carolyn, even if we lose, you'll have fought. You'll have stood up for yourself and Robert and refused to be erased. That matters." Did it? Carolyn wasn't sure anymore. Some days, fighting felt noble, standing up for principle, refusing to be bullied. Other days, it felt futile, destroying herself to prove a point only she seemed to care about. That night, unable to sleep, Carolyn wrote a letter, not to Robert this time, but to herself. "Dear Carolyn," she began, "if you're reading this, you've lost. The court ruled against you. Bradley won. Everything you fought for is gone. I'm writing this now, before the trial, to tell you you were right to fight, not because winning was guaranteed, but because surrendering was impossible. You couldn't live with yourself if you'd accepted their version of your life, the predatory widow, the gold digger, the manipulator. Even if the court believes those things, you know the truth. Robert knew the truth, and that has to be enough. You loved him. Genuinely, completely, without calculation. You were his partner, his companion, his choice. 15 years of daily life, mundane and beautiful and real. No court ruling can erase that. No judgment can invalidate those years. If you've lost everything, the money, the house, your reputation, you've still won something, your integrity. You refuse to lie about your own life. You refuse to accept less than you deserved. You refuse to disappear quietly. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Stand up, speak truth, refuse erasure. The outcome matters less than the standing. I'm proud of you. Robert would be proud of you. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you did the hard, brave, necessary thing. You fought. Love your earlier self who still has hope." Carolyn sealed the letter and put it in her bedside drawer. Insurance against despair. Proof that in this moment before the verdict, she believed in what she was doing. The trial began in 3 days. 3 days to prepare, to practice testimony, to steel herself for the ultimate confrontation. 3 days until she'd face Bradley in court and let a stranger in a robe decide which of them was telling the truth about Robert King's life, and loves and final wishes. 3 days until she'd learn whether fighting for yourself was enough or whether the system was rigged against women like her, women who dared to claim space, voice, value in their own stories. She was terrified, exhausted, barely holding herself together. But she was ready. Chapter 7. The courthouse was built in 1923, all marble columns and vaulted ceilings designed to inspire respect for the law. Carolyn climbed the steps on the first day of trial, feeling like she was ascending to her own judgment. Frances walked on one side, Jessica on the other, her armor, her support, her chosen family. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than she'd expected from television dramas. Wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, the seal of the state hanging behind the judge's bench. Real, mundane, terrifyingly official. Bradley sat at the plaintiff's table with Mitchell Carver, his expression carefully arranged into wounded dignity. He didn't look at Carolyn, hadn't looked at her directly since the deposition, as if acknowledging her existence would somehow legitimize it. The gallery was half full with journalists, curious onlookers, and a few faces Carolyn recognized from her former social circles. Amy sat in the back row, Sophie presumably with a babysitter, her presence a quiet show of support. Aaron Russo sat 2 rows behind Jessica's table, prepared to testify when called. Judge Marion Blackwell entered, a woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd heard every lie, seen every trick, and had patience for precisely none of it. She'd been assigned the case randomly, but Jessica had called it a lucky draw. "Judge Blackwell is brilliant and fair," Jessica had said. "She won't be swayed by emotion or theater. She'll follow the law and the evidence. That's exactly what we need." The opening statements began with Mitchell Carver painting his picture, a devoted son, a loving daughter, watching their elderly father fall under the influence of a younger woman who systematically isolated him from his family and manipulated him into changing his will. The age gap was emphasized, 19 years, though both parties were adults. The prenuptial agreement updates were framed as evidence of progressive manipulation. The stepchildren's absence was explained as Carolyn making them unwelcome. It was a compelling narrative if you ignored the facts. Jessica's opening was different, precise, methodical, building a case brick by brick. She presented Robert as a man of sound mind who made deliberate choices about his estate. She outlined his disappointment in his biological children, documented in business records, witness testimony, and his own private journal. She described Carolyn not as a predator, but as a partner who gave up her career to support her husband in his final years. "This case isn't about whether Carolyn King deserves an inheritance," Jessica concluded. "It's about whether Robert King had the right to choose how his estate would be distributed. The plaintiffs want you to override a dead man's explicit wishes because they disagree with his choices. That's not justice. That's entitlement." The first witness was Bradley himself. Carver walked him through a carefully constructed narrative of his relationship with his father. Childhood memories, business mentorship, the close bond they supposedly shared. He testified about noticing changes in his father after Carolyn entered his life. Becoming distant, irritable, less interested in family. "He wasn't himself," Bradley said, his voice catching with theatrical emotion. "The father I knew would never have shut us out, would never have left everything to someone he'd only known 15 years. On cross-examination, Jessica was surgical. "Mr. King, when was the last time you visited your father before his death?" Bradley hesitated. "I'm not sure of the exact date. 6 months before his death, according to the care facility logs. Does that sound right?" "We spoke regularly on the phone." "How regularly? Once a week? Once a month?" "It varied." Jessica presented phone records. "According to these records, you called your father's number 17 times in the year before his death. 12 of those calls were under 3 minutes. The remaining 5 averaged 8 minutes. Does that align with your testimony about speaking regularly?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "We had a complicated relationship." "Complicated how?" "My father could be judgmental, critical of my choices. What choices was he critical of? My career decisions, my financial management. Did your financial management include embezzling approximately $300,000 from King Industries? Carver objected loudly. Alleged embezzlement. No charges have been filed. Alleged, Jessica conceded. Mr. King, did you or did you not make unauthorized personal withdrawals from company accounts while employed at King Industries? I had signing authority. For operational expenses. Were personal expenses part of your operational authority? Bradley's face reddened. That's being investigated. I'm not discussing it without my criminal attorney present. So you're invoking your Fifth Amendment rights regarding potential financial crimes committed against your father's company. Objection! Carver was on his feet. Judge Blackwell sustained it, but the damage was done. Bradley had essentially admitted to financial misconduct while accusing Carolyn of financial manipulation. The hypocrisy hung in the air like smoke. Jessica continued, methodically dismantling Bradley's claims. She presented employment records showing his 3 terminations from King Industries. She showed the loans Robert had made and Bradley had never repaid. She demonstrated that Bradley's contact with his father decreased dramatically after Robert refused additional financial support, years before Carolyn entered the picture. By the time Bradley left the stand, his credibility was shredded. He didn't look wounded anymore. He looked angry. The second day brought Aaron Russo to the stand. His testimony was devastating for Bradley's case. Aaron described a Robert King who was mentally sharp until his death, who made strategic business decisions weeks before his stroke, who discussed his estate plans openly and deliberately. He testified about Bradley's incompetence, his inappropriate behavior with employees, Robert's disappointment in the man his son had become. Robert loved his children, Aaron said clearly, but he didn't respect them. He felt they'd squandered every opportunity he'd given them. His will reflected that reality. Aaron also testified about Carolyn and Robert's relationship. He'd witnessed their daily interactions, their intellectual partnership, the genuine affection between them. I've known Robert for 40 years, Aaron said. I saw his first marriage, cordial but not passionate. I saw him with Carolyn, genuinely happy. She challenged him intellectually, made him laugh, took care of him without making him feel diminished. If that's manipulation, then every good marriage is manipulative. On cross-examination, Carver tried to suggest Aaron had financial motivation to support Carolyn. Perhaps she'd promised him something or threatened his position in the company. But Aaron shut it down immediately. I have a contract with King Industries that predates Mrs. King's marriage and continues regardless of ownership. I have no financial stake in this case. I'm testifying because Robert King was my friend, and I won't stand by while his children lie about his mental capacity to override his explicit wishes. The third day brought medical testimony. Robert's primary physician, Dr. Chen, testified about his patient's cognitive function. Mr. King was sharp as a tack, Dr. Chen said. We discussed literature, politics, current events. He corrected my grammar on more than one occasion. He had no signs of dementia, no cognitive decline. The stroke affected his mobility, not his mind. Carver tried to suggest that medications might have affected Robert's judgment. Dr. Chen was unequivocal. The medications Mr. King was taking were for blood pressure and cholesterol. Neither affects cognitive function. He was entirely capable of making informed decisions about his estate until the day he died. Then came the home. Healthcare worker who'd assisted Carolyn with Robert's care in his final months. She testified about their relationship, the way Robert's face lit up when Carolyn entered the room, the private jokes between them, his explicit statements about his wishes. He told me once, the healthcare worker said, that his children visited out of obligation, but his wife stayed out of love. He said he'd rather have her genuine care than their dutiful appearances. Those were his exact words. Amy Porter took the stand on the fourth day, nervous but determined. She testified about being neighbors to the Kings for 5 years, about witnessing their daily routines. "They were like any married couple," Amy said. "They bickered about what to have for dinner. They held hands walking to the mailbox. Mr. King talked about Miss Carolyn constantly, how she made him think, how she challenged his assumptions. He loved her. Anyone with eyes could see it." Carver tried to rattle her, suggesting she was biased because Carolyn had befriended her, possibly with financial incentives. Amy's response was fierce. "Miss Carolyn never gave me a penny. She gave me her time. She helped my daughter with homework. She taught me about art and books and thinking for myself. She showed me what strength looks like. If that's manipulation, I hope more people manipulate me." The courtroom rippled with quiet approval. Even Judge Blackwell's expression softened slightly. On the 5th day, Jessica presented Robert's journal. She'd had it authenticated by a handwriting expert, verified by the stationery shop where he'd purchased it. The entries were read aloud. Not all of them, but the most relevant ones. The courtroom was silent as Robert's voice spoke from beyond death, his disappointments in Bradley and Sloan, his frustration with their financial dependence, his gratitude for Carolyn, his explicit wishes about the will, his prediction that they'd contest it, and his trust that Carolyn would be strong enough to defend herself. When Jessica finished reading the final entry, "I only wish I could be there to defend her," several people in the gallery were crying. Amy's face was wet with tears. Even the court reporter looked moved. Carver objected to the journal's admissibility, arguing it was hearsay. Judge Blackwell overruled him. "These are contemporaneous entries by the testator himself, documenting his state of mind and intentions. They're highly relevant and entirely admissible." Then came Carolyn's turn to testify, the moment she'd been dreading and preparing for. She walked to the stand on legs that felt like water, was sworn in, and faced the courtroom. Jessica guided her through her testimony gently. How she'd met Robert, the progression of their relationship, the decision to marry, their daily life together, his illness and her role as caregiver. Carolyn answered carefully, honestly, with the specificity of genuine memory. She described his habits, his fears, his jokes, his declining health. She talked about reading to him when his eyes tired, about the debates they had over books, about the mundane intimacy of 15 years together. "Did you love your husband?" Jessica asked. "With everything I had," Carolyn said, her voice breaking. "He was my best friend, my intellectual partner, the person I wanted to share every small moment with. Losing him—" She stopped, composed herself. "Losing him was like losing part of myself." "And did you manipulate him into changing his will?" "No, never. The will updates were his idea. He was protecting me from exactly this, from his children contesting his wishes, from people questioning our marriage, from being erased from his life story. He knew it would happen. He prepared for it, and he trusted me to be strong enough to defend what we built together." On cross-examination, Mitchell Carver came at her hard. He questioned every aspect of her relationship with Robert, looking for cracks, inconsistencies, evidence of calculation. "Mrs. King, you gave up your career after marrying my client's father. That was quite a sacrifice. What did you expect in return?" Carolyn remembered this question from the deposition. This time her answer was stronger. "I didn't expect anything. I chose partnership over career because spending time with Robert was more valuable to me than any job. Not everyone measures worth in dollars, Mr. Carver. Some of us measure it in moments." Convenient that those moments came with a $7 million estate. "The estate came with 15 years of partnership. I earned it through presence, care, and love. Your client's biological connection earned him nothing. He has to earn relationships like everyone else. Biology is an achievement." Carver tried to make her angry, to make her defensive. He brought up her first marriage, suggesting a pattern. He questioned her financial motivations. He implied she'd isolated Robert deliberately. With each accusation, Carolyn felt herself growing not weaker, but stronger. She'd spent months doubting herself, questioning her memories, wondering if they were right about her. But sitting on that stand, saying the truth out loud, she remembered who she was and what she'd lived. "Mr. Carver," she finally said, her voice quiet but carrying through the courtroom, "you can twist every fact, question every motive, reframe every kindness as manipulation. But you can't change what was true. I loved Robert. He loved me. We built a life together. And his children weren't part of that life because they chose not to be." She looked at Bradley directly for the first time since the trial began. "Your father wanted a relationship with you. He hoped until the end that you'd mature, take responsibility, see him as more than a bank account. You didn't. That's not my fault. That's your choice. And your father's will reflects the consequences of that choice." The courtroom was silent. Bradley's face was red, his hands clenched into fists. Carver attempted damage control, but Carolyn had already made her point. When she stepped down from the stand, she felt different, lighter. She'd said everything that needed saying. Whatever the judge decided, Carolyn had defended herself, her marriage, her truth. She'd refused to be silenced or diminished or erased. The closing arguments came the next day. Carver painted his picture one last time: grieving children, manipulative widow, tragic elderly man. But the narrative felt hollow now, contradicted by the evidence, by Robert's own words, by the testimony of people who'd witnessed the marriage firsthand. Jessica's closing was powerful. "Your Honor, this case asks a simple question. Did Robert King have the right to choose how his estate would be distributed? The plaintiffs say no. They say his choices should be overridden because they disagree with them. They say he was manipulated, despite every piece of evidence showing he was of sound mind. They say Carolyn King isolated him, despite evidence that they isolated themselves." Jessica paused, letting the words settle. "The truth is uncomfortable for the plaintiffs. Their father was disappointed in them. He documented that disappointment. He made choices that reflected that disappointment. Rather than accept responsibility for the relationship they didn't maintain, they're blaming the woman who did maintain it." She gestured to the evidence: the journal, the medical records, the witness testimony, the financial documents. Robert King was brilliant, sound-minded, and deliberate. He knew his children would contest his will. He prepared for it. He trusted his wife to be strong enough to defend his wishes. The question isn't whether Carolyn King deserves this inheritance. The question is whether we'll honor Robert King's autonomy and respect his explicitly stated wishes. I believe we must. Judge Blackwell took a 2-hour recess to review the evidence. 2 hours that felt like 2 years. Carolyn sat in the corridor with Frances and Jessica, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. Everything came down to this: one woman's interpretation of truth, evidence, justice. When they were called back into the courtroom, Carolyn's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. Judge Blackwell's expression was unreadable. "I've reviewed all evidence, testimony, and documentation in this case," the judge began. "The standard for contesting a will on grounds of undue influence is high. The plaintiffs must prove that the influence was so pervasive as to override the testator's free will. They have not met that burden." Carolyn's heart hammered. "The evidence shows conclusively that Robert King was of sound mind," Judge Blackwell continued. "His medical records confirm no cognitive decline. His business decisions remained sharp. His private journal entries, authenticated and admitted into evidence, demonstrate clear thinking, sound reasoning, and explicit intentions regarding his estate." The judge looked at Bradley. "The plaintiff's claim that Mrs. King isolated Mr. King from his family is contradicted by the evidence. Phone logs, visitor records, and witness testimony show that the plaintiffs chose to minimize contact with their father, particularly after he ceased providing financial support. Their absence was not caused by Mrs. King's presence. It preceded her marriage and continued by their own choice. Judge Blackwell's voice strengthened. Furthermore, the plaintiff's credibility is significantly undermined by evidence of financial misconduct. Mr. Bradley King invoked his Fifth Amendment rights rather than answer questions about unauthorized withdrawals from his father's company. This suggests exactly the kind of financial motivation he accuses Mrs. King of having. A pause. Then the words Carolyn had been waiting months to hear. The will stands as written. Mrs. Carolyn King is the rightful heir to the contested portions of the estate. Furthermore, I'm sanctioning the plaintiffs for frivolous litigation and witness intimidation. Legal fees will be paid from Mr. Bradley King's inheritance portion. The gavel fell. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Bradley's face was purple with rage. Frances grabbed Carolyn's hand. Jessica was smiling, a rare, genuine smile. They'd won. Carolyn sat frozen, unable to process it. They'd won. The judge had validated her marriage, her love, Robert's choices. The judge had seen through Bradley's lies and ruled that Robert King had the right to choose how his estate was distributed. She'd won. But more than that, she'd been seen, heard, believed. After months of being called a liar, a manipulator, a murderer, a judge had looked at the evidence and said no. This woman told the truth. This marriage was real. This love mattered. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Amy threw her arms around Carolyn. Frances had tears streaming down her face. Jessica was fielding calls from reporters, her voice professional but triumphant. And Carolyn stood in the marble hallway of the 1923 courthouse, sunlight streaming through tall windows, and felt something she hadn't felt in months: peace. Chapter 8. 6 months after the verdict, Carolyn stood in Robert's rose garden, her rose garden now, with pruning shears in hand and early autumn sunlight warming her shoulders. The peace roses he'd planted for their 5th anniversary were thriving, but she'd added new varieties alongside them. White roses symbolizing fresh starts, yellow roses for friendship, deep red ones that bloomed late into the season, resilient and strong. The garden was both memorial and evolution, honoring what Robert had created while making space for what came next. Frances found her there, 2 cups of coffee in hand, their morning ritual, now that Carolyn was back in her own home. "You look different," Frances observed, settling onto the garden bench. "Different how?" "Lighter, like you're not carrying the weight of proving yourself anymore." Carolyn considered this. It was true. Something had shifted after the verdict, not just the external validation, though that mattered, but an internal recognition that she didn't need anyone's permission to claim her own story. She'd fought for it, defended it, and won. But more importantly, she'd learned she was strong enough to fight regardless of outcome. "I'm still working on it," Carolyn admitted. "Some days I wake up angry about what they put me through. Other days I'm just grateful it's over." Both can be true. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, watching a cardinal land among the roses. Life had slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the definition of normal had changed permanently. The house felt like home again. She'd reclaimed Robert's study, reorganized it as her own workspace. The vandalized wall had been repaired and painted a warm cream color. New photos hung there now. Pictures of Robert, yes, but also pictures of Frances, Amy and Sophie, Aaron, Jessica. Her chosen family, the people who'd stood with her when standing was costly. The financial settlement from the lawsuit had been deposited into her account 3 months ago, $7 million minus legal fees. More money than Carolyn had ever imagined having. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, with plenty left over for the causes she cared about. She'd created the Robert King Foundation for Arts Education the month after the verdict. The foundation funded art programs in underserved schools, providing supplies, instruction, and opportunities for children who might never otherwise encounter creative expression. It was Robert's wealth combined with Carolyn's expertise, exactly the kind of partnership their marriage had been. Last week, she'd visited the first school to receive funding, a fifth-grade class in a low-income neighborhood, 23 kids who'd never had an art teacher before. They'd painted self-portraits, bold, colorful, honest depictions of how they saw themselves. One girl had painted herself with wings. Another had given herself a crown. A boy had painted stars exploding from his hands. "This is how you see yourself?" Carolyn had asked the boy. "This is how I feel inside," he'd corrected. "Like there's all this stuff in me waiting to come out." That was art's power. Giving voice to the internal, making visible the invisible, helping people see themselves more clearly. Robert had understood that. The foundation was his legacy, but it was also Carolyn's contribution, proof that she'd honored his memory by building something meaningful rather than simply spending his money. The community's response to her victory had been mixed. Some people had apologized for doubting her, awkward, halting apologies that Carolyn accepted without requiring groveling. Others had simply drifted back into her orbit, pretending they'd never doubted at all. A few had doubled down on believing the worst, convinced the legal system had been corrupted or fooled. Carolyn had learned to care less about public opinion. The people who mattered knew the truth. The people who didn't matter would believe what they wanted, regardless of evidence. She couldn't control that, and she'd stopped trying. The museum had asked her to return to the acquisitions committee. She'd declined, not out of bitterness, but because she'd discovered she didn't want to volunteer anymore. She wanted a real role, using her expertise professionally. At 73, she was consulting for 2 galleries, curating exhibitions, and considering teaching an art history course at the community college. Robert's death hadn't ended her career. Fighting for her inheritance had somehow restarted it. Amy knocked on the garden gate, Sophie bouncing beside her with the irrepressible energy of a 7-year-old. "Miss Carolyn, Mama said I can help you plant bulbs." Carolyn smiled, gesturing them in. "Perfect timing. I was just about to start." They worked together in the garden, Sophie chattering about school while carefully placing tulip bulbs in prepared holes. Amy was glowing. She'd completed her teaching degree and started her first job at Sophie's elementary school. Her transformation from uncertain single mother to confident educator had happened in parallel with Carolyn's own journey. "I've been thinking about what you said during the trial," Amy said quietly while Sophie was distracted by a butterfly. "About earning relationships rather than expecting them because of biology. It made me realize I'd been letting my ex-husband's family treat me like I owed them something just because Sophie shares their DNA. I've been setting boundaries. It's been hard, but necessary." "Good," Carolyn said firmly. "You don't owe anyone access to your life or your daughter's. Family is earned through presence and love, not demanded through genetics. That's what I'm teaching Sophie. That family is who shows up. Who cares? Who loves you even when it's not convenient?" Amy smiled. "She calls you Grandma Carolyn now. Is that okay?" Tears pricked Carolyn's eyes. "It's more than okay. It's an honor." She'd never had biological children, never had grandchildren through conventional means. But here was Sophie, this bright, curious child who'd chosen to call her grandma. Here was a relationship built on genuine affection rather than obligation. Here was family, real family, earned through showing up, through caring, through being present. Bradley and Sloane's absence in her life felt less like loss and more like relief these days. Bradley had been ordered to pay a portion of her legal fees as sanction for frivolous litigation. He'd also been investigated for embezzlement. The case was still pending, but it looked like criminal charges would be filed. She should probably feel sympathy for him. She didn't. He'd made his choices. He was living with the consequences. Sloane had reached out once since the trial. A brief email. "I hope you're well. I'm sorry for my part in everything that happened. I'm working on becoming someone Dad would be proud of. It's harder than I thought." Carolyn had replied simply, "I hope you find peace with your father's memory. That's something you do for yourself, not for me. She didn't need Sloane's apology or friendship. She didn't need Bradley's acceptance or respect. She'd learned that she could be complete without their validation, whole without their approval. Her worth wasn't determined by whether Robert's biological children accepted her. It was determined by how she saw herself, how she lived her values, how she honored the love she and Robert had shared. That evening, Frances stayed for dinner. Grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, eaten on the patio as the sun set over the garden. They'd opened a bottle of good wine, the kind Robert used to save for special occasions. Carolyn had decided that being alive, being free, being herself, those were special occasions enough. "I've been thinking about dating," Carolyn said suddenly. Frances nearly choked on her wine. "Dating? Is that so shocking? I'm 73, not dead." "It's not shocking, it's wonderful. I'm just surprised you're ready." Carolyn considered. Was she ready? She'd loved Robert deeply. She always would. But that love didn't preclude the possibility of new connection, new companionship, new chapters. "I'm not looking to replace him," she said carefully. "No one could. But I'm lonely sometimes, and I've learned that I'm allowed to want things for myself, allowed to seek joy, connection, partnership. Robert would want that for me. He absolutely would. So, any prospects?" Carolyn laughed. "I've been invited to coffee by a man I met at the community center. He volunteers teaching painting to seniors. We had a nice conversation about abstract expressionism." And I said yes. Coffee, nothing more. Just seeing if I still remember how to do this. "You'll be brilliant, just like you were brilliant at fighting for yourself, just like you're brilliant at everything you put your mind to." After Frances left, Carolyn stood in Robert's study, her study now, and pulled out the letter she'd written to herself before the trial. The one that started, "Dear Carolyn, if you're reading this, you've lost." She read it through, tears streaming down her face. The woman who'd written this letter had been terrified, exhausted, barely holding on. She'd believed in her cause but doubted her strength. She'd written insurance against despair, but she hadn't needed it. She'd won, not just the legal battle, but something more important. She'd won back herself, her voice, her certainty, her right to claim space in her own story. Carolyn pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a new letter. "Dear past self, you were right to fight. Not because winning was guaranteed, it wasn't, but because surrendering was impossible. You couldn't live with yourself if you'd accepted their version of your life. You won. The court validated Robert's choices, your marriage, the truth you've been defending, but more importantly, you discovered something. You didn't need the court to validate you. You knew the truth all along. The legal victory was wonderful, but the internal victory, learning that you're strong enough to stand alone, to fight for yourself, to refuse erasure, that was everything. Robert would be proud of you. I'm proud of you. You did the hard, brave, necessary thing. You fought, and you won. Not just in court, but in the battle for your own self-worth. The money is nice. The house is nice. But the real inheritance is this. You know who you are. You know you're strong enough to stand up when standing is costly. You know your love was real, your marriage valid, your place in Robert's life earned through 15 years of partnership. No one can take that from you, not Bradley's accusations, not public opinion, not legal challenges. You claimed your story. You defended your truth. You refused to disappear. And now you're building something new. The foundation honors Robert's memory. The friendships you've deepened honor the people who stood with you. The boundaries you've established honor your right to protect your peace. The new chapters you're beginning honor your right to keep living, keep growing, keep seeking joy. You're not just Robert King's widow. You're Carolyn King, curator, philanthropist, friend, survivor, fighter, grandmother by choice. You're a woman who loved deeply, lost profoundly, and fought fiercely. You're someone who knows her worth and refuses to accept less than she deserves. Keep going. Keep growing. Keep claiming space. The best chapters are still ahead. With love and respect, your future self. Carolyn folded the letter and placed it beside the first one. Evidence of journey, documentation of growth, proof that she'd survived the worst and emerged not just intact, but stronger. She walked to the window overlooking the garden. Robert's roses glowed in the moonlight, beautiful and resilient. Tomorrow she'd plant those tulip bulbs with Sophie. Next week, she'd have coffee with the man from the community center. Next month, she'd launch the foundation's second round of grants. Life kept unfolding. New possibilities kept emerging. And Carolyn King, not just Robert King's widow, was ready for all of it. 3 months later, Carolyn stood before a packed auditorium at the community college. She'd been invited to speak about her experience. Not the legal battle specifically, but the broader theme of finding your voice, claiming your worth, refusing to be silenced. The audience was diverse. Young women just starting careers, middle-aged women navigating divorce or reinvention, older women facing the invisibility society imposes on aging women. They'd come to hear her story. What she gave them was bigger than that. "I'm here to talk about empowerment," she began, "but not the kind you see in motivational posters, not the kind that's easy or comfortable or Instagram-worthy. Real empowerment, the kind that costs something, the kind you have to fight for." She told her story. Not all the details, but the essential truth. She'd loved, lost, and been forced to defend that love against people who wanted to erase her from the narrative. She'd doubted herself. She'd nearly surrendered. But she'd found strength she didn't know she had. "People ask me if it was worth it," she said. "Worth the stress, the scrutiny, the public humiliation, the months of my life consumed by legal battle. And here's what I tell them. I didn't fight for money. I fought for the right to exist fully in my own story. I fought against being erased, dismissed, delegitimized. And yes, that was worth it." She paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Women nodding, women crying, women recognizing their own battles in her words. You don't need a legal case to apply this lesson. Every time someone tells you you're too much or not enough, too old or too ambitious, too successful or too dependent, that's erasure. Every time you apologize for taking up space, for having needs, for wanting recognition for your contributions, that's self-erasure. And every time you stand up and say, "No, I matter, my voice counts, my story is valid," that's empowerment. She shared specific lessons. Stop trying to prove your worth to people who've already decided you're worthless. You know your value. That has to be enough. Grace doesn't mean accepting disrespect. You can be kind and firm, gentle and unyielding. Some people will always believe the worst about you. Their opinion reflects them, not you. Fighting for yourself isn't selfish. It's essential. You can't honor anyone's memory by betraying yourself. And most importantly, you're allowed to claim space, use your voice, refuse to shrink, not because you've earned the right through suffering or achievement, but because you exist. That's reason enough. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, women lined up to speak with her, sharing their own stories of fighting for custody, for inheritance, for professional recognition, for the right to be seen and heard and valued. Each story was different. Each story was the same. Carolyn hugged them, listened to them, offered what wisdom she could. She gave them Jessica's contact information for legal issues. She shared resources for women going through similar battles. She reminded them, "You're not alone." This pattern of dismissing women's contributions, questioning women's motives, erasing women from narratives, it's systemic, but together, we can change it. As the auditorium emptied, a young woman in her 20s approached hesitantly. "Miss King, I just wanted to say, my grandmother is going through something similar. Her stepchildren are contesting her late husband's will. She's been so scared talking about just accepting their settlement offer. But I'm going to show her the video of your talk. You've given her a blueprint. You've shown her it's possible to win. Carolyn gripped the young woman's hand. Tell your grandmother something for me. Whether she wins or loses the legal battle, if she stands up and fights, she's already won the important fight. The fight for her own dignity, her own voice, her own right to claim her story. I will, thank you, for fighting, for sharing, for showing us what's possible. After everyone left, Carolyn sat alone in the empty auditorium. One woman's story rippling outward. One woman's courage, inspiring another's. One woman's refusal to be erased, creating space for others to claim their own narratives. That had been Robert's legacy. Not just the money he'd left behind, but the ripple effects of his choices. By choosing Carolyn, by documenting his reasoning, by trusting her to defend his wishes, he'd created a precedent. Not just legally, but culturally. He'd shown that late-life love matters, that second spouses deserve protection, that biological children don't automatically override a deceased's explicit wishes. His death had given Carolyn a platform she'd never wanted, but she was using it now, not to relitigate her case, but to help other women fighting similar battles, to change the narrative, to insist that women's stories, women's loves, women's contributions matter regardless of who believes them. A year after the verdict, on what would have been Robert's 79th birthday, Carolyn returned to the gallery where they'd met. The same Rothko painting that had sparked their first conversation still hung on the wall. Bold blocks of orange and red and yellow, chaos and beauty in equal measure. She stood before it, remembering. The first time she'd seen Robert standing in this exact spot, genuinely moved by the painting rather than pretending to understand it for social credit. The conversation that had followed, the coffee date, the life they'd built. I miss you, she whispered to his memory, every day, but I'm okay, better than okay. I'm living fully, the way you'd want me to. I'm not just surviving your death, I'm thriving beyond it. She'd brought white roses, her new favorites, the ones symbolizing fresh starts. She left them on the bench where they'd sat during that first conversation, a private memorial to a public space that held the beginning of their story. As she left the gallery, her phone buzzed, a text from the man she'd been dating, David, a retired architect who loved art and literature and could debate philosophy for hours without trying to win the argument. They'd been seeing each other for 4 months. Nothing serious yet, maybe never serious, but companionable, pleasant. A reminder that loving Robert didn't preclude other connections. Dinner tonight? I'm cooking, she texted back. I'd love that. Life kept unfolding. New chapters kept beginning. And Carolyn King, survivor, fighter, curator, grandmother by choice, woman who'd claimed her own story, was ready for all of it. Carolyn's fight reminds us that our worth isn't determined by who believes in us. It's determined by whether we believe in ourselves. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about your own power, let me know in the comments. Share your own moments of standing up, claiming space, refusing to shrink, and don't forget to subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories, because every woman's journey to empowerment deserves to be told and celebrated. The story of Carolyn King didn't end with a verdict. It continued in the lives she touched, the women she inspired, the foundation she built. It continued in Sophie calling her grandma, in Frances's unwavering friendship, in Amy's newfound confidence. It continued in the roses that bloomed each spring, some planted by Robert, some planted by Carolyn, all thriving together in the garden they'd created. It continued in the quiet certainty she'd earned through fire, that she was enough, had always been enough, didn't need anyone's permission to exist fully, love deeply, claim rightfully what was hers. She'd fought for her inheritance and won, but the real inheritance, the one that mattered most, wasn't money. It was the knowledge that she could stand alone, fight for herself, and refuse to be erased from her own story. That was worth more than $7 million. That was worth everything. And that unshakable sense of self-worth, that refusal to accept less than she deserved, that courage to claim space even when claiming space came with a price, that was what she'd carry forward into whatever chapters came next. Bold grandmother fought for her inheritance, but more importantly, she fought for herself, and she won both battles. The rest was just living, fully, authentically, unapologetically, exactly as Robert had hoped she would, exactly as she'd learned she could. That was the real victory. That was the real story. That was the real inheritance she'd pass on to every woman brave enough to claim her own.